voices lately, so I've been thinking about how. So I rewatched Hal, like the Hal voice.
Yeah, from Space
In
2001.
fact, I might name my tomato plant Hal.
That would be sinister.
Is it? I mean, in a way, it's kind of
You're not going to get red tomatoes out of this tomato plant. Just warning you. Oh, you'll get deep purple.
dark, like black.
Yeah, it's called Black Russian, but you'll get it's like a plum, like a deep plum colour.
If you didn't know already, Nick Knight knows quite a lot about gardening and tomato plants, which, clearly that's why he was honoured.
So welcome to Fashion Gardens question time. on our subject today is
Spring watch.
we're not going to do Louis Vuitton. We're going to do the Black Russian tomato plant.
I mean, we can make that a thing. I think it would have some weight. I think a lot of people that I know that work in fashion have an outlet, right, that has nothing to do with fashion because you kind of need that.
I think you need them at times.
Yeah, there's just an escape. Well, before we get into it, I wonder if maybe we could just go around the table, so the headmistress, and if you could just tell the audience your name and maybe kind of a little bit about yourself, and then we'll get into our discussion. Andrew, do you want to start since you're a pro? You've been here before.
My name's Andrew Davis. Where's the camera?
I'd go for that camera. If you're talking to the camera, I'd go for that one.
My name's Andrew Davis, and I'm a fashion stylist.
But on at the end of the table.
I think he's just trying to get his angle. He's trying to get his light. Yes. Yeah, you got it.
My name's Andrew Davis, and I'm a fashion stylist and consultant based in London.
Good.
Hi, my name is Stefano. I am studying fashion communication and promotion at St. Martin's.
Oh, hi, my name is Mood. I'm an FCP student at Central St. Martin.
Hi, I'm Nick Knight. I'm the director of SHOWstudio.
I'm Emily Zak, and I'm chairing this panel today, amongst other things.
I'm Jess Bird,
Not normal.
a fashion illustrator.
Brilliant, thank you.
Hi, I'm Rayton, fashion designer based in London.
Wonderful. Well, the topic today is really, it's interesting because we were talking right before this started, as usual, about what it means to be a fashion critic now. And now it's so many sources and so many opinions about fashion shows and designers, and it's certainly not the way it was when I started out in my career, where there was sort of the fashion critics, the writers at Vogue, the writers at the different magazines had so much power and sway. I think, particularly for those who are students right now, it must seem like you probably don't realize how different it is, but it's a very different world than it was even 10, 15 years ago before social media.
I'm just going to bring 3 more people into the table.
Oh, amazing, yeah.
I'll get in the chairs.
Great. I'd love to know from people who are students or studying or recently graduated, how do you perceive fashion criticism? Do you read fashion criticism or what that means to you? Do you sort of seek out different opinions on social? Where do you kind of have discussions about fashion?
So I think it's pretty instant on social medias. However, the quality of the content, it's not the greatest. And for me personally, I've always seen fashion critics on social media is kind of all the same. They were all positive about it.
Yeah.
I could never find someone that was mad or negative about a show or a fashion moment. So then I started reading more journals and more newspaper, and I think I think it's interesting. I think they always have a point. It's nice to read, it's nice to know, but I wish they could be more real about what they think. It's kind of they always talk I think you can tell when a show was not great because they talk about maybe the set too much, the models who was in front row, who wasn't, and then you kind of understand, maybe there was not enough to talk about.
For the
Yeah.
photos. That's a really good point, actually. Does it make you feel less than if you're reading something? It doesn't gel with your experience. It just makes you does it make you just think, well, I'm not that interested then in what this person has to say?
Yeah, I was kind of because, for example, when we have conversation with friends, with people who are just passionate about it, we always have a point that is very polarized kind of. And I think fashion critics are not it's kind of rare to find like a critic that is like very polarized, very like.
But do you know what that is?
It's like.
Advertising.
Yeah.
Advertising. The magazines survive on advertising. If you're, let's not pick on any particular brand, if you're the owner of a very big brand and that particular magazine is slagging off your collection, you will get your person to phone up the magazine and say, we will pull our advertising from your magazine if you criticise us again.
But why maybe they don't find like other sources of income?
Sorry?
Why they don't find like other sources of income instead of like just fashion brand they fight for kind of?
I'm so sorry, I'm
Why did
bad here
they
again.
find more sources of income, right? Is that what
Yeah,
you're
like a different
Why don't
source of
magazines
income.
find more sources of
You know
income
what?
rather than advertising?
saying? Really
Like no, but like other times.
So this is Ellie. Hi. And Adam. Can I take a seat?
Hi.
Should we get extra blocks for you?
Join us. I mean, the problem is, and where the fashion criticism has sort of stalled, that there has never been much of a history of serious, biting criticism for fashion. Music has it, film has it, opera has it, literature has it, really ferocious critics. Fashion never really has. So it doesn't have that history. And that's partly being fashion's dilemma, is it's not really being considered a true art, partly because of that. So it's a sort of commercial art. It just exists to make money. That was a sort of theory behind it. So it's avoided the fashion criticism. I mean, I realised that some years ago, and that's why I started doing panels. And we don't carry any advertising at all on SHOWstudio, so we can say Louis Vuitton was blah, or the Prada was blah, and they can't do anything to us. They didn't realise that at first.
Like it?
They don't like it. They didn't realise that at first. Do you remember when Eddie went to Saint Laurent?
Yeah.
Okay, there was a very heavy press sort of control of that shift in the identity. We criticised that collection, or the panel criticised that collection, and we got a very quick phone call saying, we'd like to meet you and have a little chat. They met us and had a little chat and realised there's nothing they could do. Other than ban us from the show, we're banned from quite a few shows, so it doesn't really matter. So when they don't have that sort of
financial.
that power to be able to shut critics up, then they get a little bit weird about it. And of course now you've got critics who can sit in their bedrooms in Tennessee or wherever and wax lyrical about what they think about the shows, whether they've been there or not or know nothing. And if they get a huge following, they become very important. So there's much more of a sort of line of fashion criticism which is quite vicious. There was some New York guy who was such a bitch. And really everything they did was to kind of it was like horrendous to listen to.
Just for the sake of it almost.
Yes, for the sake of being bitchy. But they're previously to sort of the internet and certainly to SHOWstudio doing panels and the sort of uprise of the blogger and everything else, there was nothing coming out. You know, if somebody like, I really don't want to bring names into it because they're all doing a job and it's fine. But they just couldn't criticise. The pieces, Emily might testify to this, were rewritten until they towed the magazine line. So you can't say to your advertiser that's taking out hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of advertising, keeping your magazine afloat, actually your show is now irrelevant and nobody cares. You should have stopped in the 1980s. Why don't you give up? You wouldn't want to say that in any case. But you can't really do that if that's a person that's paying your wages and the wages of your 20 staff or 400 staff or whatever it is. So it's a very difficult relationship. And also the designers are not used to it. So they don't, on the whole, they don't like getting criticism because they're not used to it. I think it's very short-sighted. So I think everybody, myself included, who's in the creative arts, should be open to criticism. How on earth do we get better if we don't know, an honest opinion on what we do? So that's brings me up to a slightly other subject, is we're talking about people criticising the shows, but nobody criticises the advertising campaigns. I can do a huge campaign for Chanel or Vuitton or whatever. Nobody takes it apart critically and says, well, actually, this is really appalling imagery. This puts, blah, 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 blah. Diet Prada started to, but it wasn't based, in my opinion, my knowledge, based on an artistic criticism. It was based on a kind of, they ripped off this person or whatever. It was less of a sort of, this is just a very puerile image or whatever it is. So there's no criticism of fashion photography, which I think, I'll stop ranting on the monologue, but I think that's really weird because the big campaigns that you do are seen globally. So we occupy a lot of visual space across this planet. You do a big campaign for a big brand, you'll see it on every bus, on every in the back of every magazine, on every billboard, etc., throughout the whole of the world. I used to find it really freaky when I was doing Christian Dior back in the 2000s, that my ads, I'd go anywhere. I'd go a little mountain village in Finland, pick up a magazine that'd be there, or be on a little thing. Fashion advertising is so omnipresent in this world, and yet there's no serious criticism of it. So that's where I stand on criticism. That's my opinion of it.
But I was going to say, I think definitely in the 90s, like the critic at the Herald Tribune was critical of shows, and she would get moved back the season after. She'd go 3 seats behind where she was sitting, and the designers that's how they would reward her with what her thing. But her opinions affected share prices in the 90s, and I think that role as a critic is not the same anymore. I don't think they have that power.
Yeah, but that's what it should do. I mean, if you put a record out and you get a really bad review, you won't sell so many records. That's the nature of criticism in the arts.
Yeah, but there's a famous female critic for one of the broadsheets, and she criticised that recent Gucci show and was quite and really didn't like the show, and said it, and she'd worked for a large paper that definitely takes advertising money from this brand, and I thought that was really brave to stick your neck out.
Have a better track record here. I mean, I should say, for full disclosure, I worked at Vogue for about 15 years, so all in all, Vogue or Condé Nast for a long, long time, and my last role was to analyze what we could do better around fashion criticism, so this is a topic I've probably spent far too much time thinking about. But I think it's, I think the newspapers have sort of kept a little closer to this idea of, I'm not saying it's perfect, but I think magazines had an opportunity to change the model. And I think it's also worth remembering this is a very niche, I don't know how many people, I'd love to hear from some of the students again, I started by saying, what do you feel when you read it, but do you even read it? Or have you just kind of given up on sort of the traditional fashion criticism as being out of touch?
I feel like for me personally, it's not something that I gravitate towards, because now with everything,
you don't need to.
It's very consumable. Videos are consumable. I want to watch something quick. I want to understand the point, and also because speaking about the brand agency, having this power of financial power on certain publications, it makes it feel. How many, what out of it, what number would you be saying the truth, or criticizing this in
So you're skeptical when you're reading it?
Yeah, it's very skeptical. So I tend to go for independent critics, fashion commentators, that are gonna have their own opinion without an influence of a huge brand on it. So that's the most. Yeah.
That's what social media has allowed us to have now, is a multitude of voices talking about fashion, and you choose your own person whose opinion you like. But Emily was starting the conversation by saying fashion has really changed. Certainly in the last 20 years since the advent of the internet and social media. Before it was a very much more monodirectional thing. So if a fashion critic said, or a fashion designer said the hemlines are going up, they went up across the board. There was just one vision of what fashion was. Now, thank God, there's so many different opinions and visions and cultures and takes on it, and different seasons across the world, and it's much more reflective of the world we actually live in, rather than this sort of very autocratic, it's the sort of, and again, I want to skirt around names, but what's that film about fashion? Devil Wears Prada? The sort of central character of that was the sort of fearful doyen of fashion, who's sort of based on Cruella de Vil. But it's that sort of terrifying fashion critic who will sweep in, and that character has been very dominant in fashion since the 1950s. And so you can look back at films like Kiet Vu, Polly Magoo, which is William Klein, I wouldn't say piss take, but it's a William Klein parody of fashion. And there's a sort of, the woman walks into the fashion show and nobody sits until she's there. And, she sits down and then the fashion show starts. And that was in the 1970s. And then you've got people like Diana Vreeland and people before that who were fearsome and also very feared within the industry because their view was the view. Now we have a multitude of views, which is a much better situation.
I guess for those of you joining us, we're kind of periodically ask you to introduce yourself again. I'm sorry just because the audience might be tuning in and tuning out, and if you could just tell us your names and maybe a little bit about what you do.
And the camera to introduce yourself to is that one that my assistant Christoph is fiddling with.
Okay.
And just before you do, I'm so sorry to keep interrupting. I will actually just go in a minute. Christoph, if you have a moment, if you could offer people the biscuits and the cakes and things, because it's quite hard socially to reach across and grab that lovely cucumber sandwich that I've been eyeing up since I've been sitting here. So if you have a minute, just waft them up and down the table.
Of course.
Sorry.
So I'm Adam Andrasik. I was a creative director at Gila Roche. I'm a CSM MA grad. I now teach at Ravensbourne University on the BA Fashion program. I also teach on digital technology for fashion there as well. And these are my two students, Emmy Banks and Hannah. Do you want to introduce yourselves?
Hey, I'm Emmy Banks. I've just graduated from Ravensbourne.
And I'm Hannah. I just graduated from Ravensbourne Digital Fashion Pathway.
Human or yours?
Yep, I can't actually get
You're good, don't worry.
We'll find you.
My name's Newman. I'm a digital artist and involved in a lot of stuff to do with Web3. Been involved in space for about 2 years, and also starting to get to the digital fashion side of things.
Amazing. Thanks so much. I mean, actually, it's interesting you say that because I'm really interested in the differences between the way tech has evolved and the way fashion. So, Nick, you were talking about how fashion has evolved was and probably still is very top down. I think it's changing, obviously, but if you look at the way sort of Web3 and the tech of development has started off in open source, it's almost the opposite, effectively, of that approach. And so it's really interesting to me when those worlds come together because they could not have different sort of approaches. And I think maybe as it develops, I'd love to know what you think, but as it develops, it might become more top-down. Obviously, you might get the bigger players determining what the metaverse looks like, but I mean, if we're thinking about it in the frame of fashion criticism, it's really around who gets the voice, like who gets to decide when something is worthwhile and what is the kind of view. And I think that's why it's still important, I think, to talk about fashion criticism, even though maybe the position of the critics have changed a lot. I wonder how, we've got our AI fashion critic as we speak, ready and poised to answer. But yeah, I mean, I'm curious what you think.
I think a lot of Web2 brands have tried to get involved in that space, but not really done well. Louis Vuitton have recently got involved in the Web3 space to start off by selling these digital trunks for $41,000 each. I think they sold about 70 out of 210. So I'm excited to see what they do next. They had a show yesterday, and I think there's a speedy bag. That's what it's called. It was exclusive to the NFT holders. But a lot of brands are trying to tap into that space. It's a bit difficult to see who pulls it off. A lot of brands have failed, such as Porsche. They didn't do well at all in the space.
Why do you think that is? Do you think the audiences aren't the same, maybe?
I think it's potentially the people they're consulting, and it just doesn't really work out in the long run. I'm excited to see smaller brands get involved and make it more accessible to people who may not be spending $2,000-3,000 on Louis Vuitton. Smaller independent brands, and seeing how they can create an audience in the Web3 space and just make items exclusive to them. But I do feel like with the Louis Vuitton thing happening a couple of days ago where they got involved, it's going to open a lot of doors up for them.
So what's the Louis Vuitton thing?
It's basically a
digital trunk.
Yeah, it's a digital trunk, and I think no one really knows what they've got access to, but they have released yesterday a exclusive bag for these holders. I think these bags are really hard to get.
Right.
I think they're called Speedy Louis Vuitton bags, the small ones. Yeah. And I also think they're going to start putting on events just for these holders.
Right, so it's a bit like the NFT principle.
Yeah. So it's basically an NFT.
Right, okay, right. Yes. But you get a trunk and you won't know what's in it.
Or it's just a trunk.
There's
just nothing in it.
But it's only available
it's
in
just
that
a trunk.
space as opposed to being like a physical.
But could it be full of kind of like thousands of pounds worth of Louis Vuitton goods or nothing? Is there a risk element here?
I reckon it's a trunk, but they're hoping that it'll increase in value like a piece of art or an NFT.
Yeah, like Andy Warhol.
I don't think it's going to increase the value because they didn't manage to sell out. They only sold 68 out of
But
210.
in 20 years, will it hopefully be worth more? Yeah, I think slowly.
I'm not sorry to be a bit thick here. I still can't get to the core of this. What's in the trunk? Or is it just a trunk?
It's literally just a...
It's just a trunk. It's not like a kind of present with it.
No, so it's not like a reveal thing where, you know, you find out. I think it's more of like a pass to get exclusive access to things. You still have to buy.
Okay, so it's your ticket into World of Louis Vuitton.
Yeah.
But why do you think that it hasn't done well up until now? Because you started by saying you don't think the Web2 brands have really done this right.
I think with Louis Vuitton, I think because of the price point, to be honest, and you know, a lot of factors with crypto issues and just a lot of doubt. But I feel like with the Louis Vuitton thing, I think the fact that they had, you know, a connect wallet option on their homepage is a big thing for the Web3 space because it means they're moving forward, and they've changed the whole website to connect your wallet, allow people to get involved in that space. And you know, who would have thought in the last couple of years that would have been happening? It's probably the biggest brand in the world doing that. So,
do you think that's Pharrell? Who do you think's pushing this?
Well, Pharrell's involved in the Doodles project, so I think he's got something to do with it. He has a big say on it in terms of what's going to happen with the trunk.
I mean, the Louis Vuitton innovation team are pretty active in that space, I know, from my own experience. So, but I think it's really interesting because, as I said, the cultures are very different, and I think that's where it's maybe fallen down a little bit because the crypto audience is very different. They expect a lot more transparency, coming back to a lot more, like it's almost anti-establishment a little bit. It's sort of, so it's interesting when these establishment heritage brands are taking that on and trying to recreate something that's almost in their own DNA. So it's interesting how this is like a hybrid sort of situation. But I don't know. I mean, I don't know if anyone else has a feeling about where things are going. Do you think we're all going to have AI kind of fashion critique in the future? Like, because it's interesting. It's basically our lovely AI critic. I mean, they are just grabbing from. I mean, it's remarkable how on point it is. It feels like you could be reading a review from any of the magazines, and it sounds a lot like.
And it's reasonably accurate. If you ask it for its favourite piece from a collection, it's reasonably good at answering it. I think it's been out like 5 times so far. We've had it reviewed 5 different shows. I wanted it to be more conversational. So I was interested in this because one weekend I was just by myself. I thought, I'm really lonely. I started speaking to Siri, and that's a really unsatisfying conversation. Really not, you don't get much love back from Siri. You can try, but you don't get it. So I thought, would it be really nice to have somebody you could just chat to? So partly from that, and partly because, you know, I think as a creative, I follow the areas in life which have the most energy. Because there's so much energy being poured into AI at the moment, it's hard not to be drawn to that. So I was sort of interested in what we can do with that. It's not as conversational as I like it yet. So therefore, if you ask it a question, it'll answer it. But if you ask it an offshoot of that question after that, it won't remember that it's answered it already. And because we have lots of different people asking it questions, it can't differentiate between all different voices, so it thinks it's just one person. It's not, but it's its first outing. Give it some slack to begin with. It's got the couture shows to do next. That'll be fun.
You mentioned, I mean, to your point about, I think earlier about how, you know, in a way, fashion is missing the opportunity to have that kind of critical feedback loop. I do think the AI space could be an interesting space, but equally, I also wonder. I mean, in university, you know, you guys, you've just graduated. You're still in the program, or you've just graduated as well? You both just graduated. I wonder, like, I'd be really curious to hear from you guys, or you indeed, because you're leading the direction of the curriculum. But how do you know, or do you look at like fashion criticism? Or is that even a consideration for you?
I don't look at it much anymore, personally. I experienced it pretty rough firsthand. So the first piece of criticism I ever got was actually from SHOWstudio. It was Alexander Fury, I remember.
Excellent.
Yeah, it was Alexander Fury, but it was good. He had done a roundup and he named the work that I'd done in it in the MA collection, and then that ended up causing a little bit of a rant for me, and then I started my label. But then I went to Paris, and then the first real criticism of an actual show that I had done on schedule was Tim Blank's. So I went from basically nobody reviewing the show, nobody even putting it on, to Tim showing up and not liking it. So it was, quite a sort of learning experience. But at the same time, you had, one critic not liking it, but then British folk really liked it. And then the next season it switched. And then the season after that, it was kind of lukewarm. And then after that, everyone liked it. So it was that sort of thing where I got to the point where I just kept thinking, I just have to build this work and these collections based off of the feeling that I have and how I want this label to progress. At the time when I started at Guy Laroche, Demna had just come out with Vetements about 2 seasons before. And you could feel in Paris that that's where it was going to go. So you had a real dilemma, at least I did as a creative. I can do one of two things. I can either follow that, but never really try and stake my own claim. Like I knew it was going that way, but I knew that if I did that, at some point, somebody's going to say, that's Demna. Or you say, okay, well, maybe I can carve out a little piece for myself. And when I look back on this in 10 years, I can say, I gave it a go. I tried my own aesthetic. So that's kind of what I did. But, going forward, I don't really look at it that much, only because I feel that I understand enough about the ecosystem and enough about culture and design, and I've seen it shift over 20 years that I feel like I can read where it's going next, which is what I try to give my students in that curriculum. But I mean, how do you react to that? I mean, do you look at the show's criticism in that way?
I feel like as a student, you kind of look at what you're interested in. So you don't really follow like the big articles. You kind of go towards, for example, people that you follow on social media because you feel like a connection with them because you have similar opinions. But I guess with criticism in general, you kind of have to take it with a pinch of salt because not everyone's going to particularly like what you're doing, and then you're going to find someone that loves what you're doing. So yeah, you kind of have to roll with it, I guess.
Yeah, I guess the only person we've had criticizing us is Adam.
Yeah.
But I feel like it's...
What about your fellow students? Do you not get roasted?
Yeah, well, I think at the start we were all kind of like, oh, it's really nice. And then as we got into it and we'd be like, what do you think of this? Like, I need someone that's going to be honest with me. And I guess like you kind of need that to kind of grow. And we're in that kind of space where we're like still young designers and like trying to find our feet, and we need someone to be like, I mean, Adam's very good at, you've got something here, but you need to work on this, or develop this slightly, and it's kind of almost like nurturing us in a like critical way to help us like develop and kind of reflect, and I guess like kind of develop things in a way that's gonna push us.
Yeah, because I think it can be personal, can feel personal, but I mean, even if we're not just talking about, let's say, the traditional fashion critics, the ones you named, we could think, I mean, there's so many sources now that you can look to that are, maybe what it comes down to is like you need to trust the person that's reviewing or criticizing what you're doing. Because, you said that designers aren't used to it. I think they are used to it when they're in school. Like they're getting it, tons probably more than they almost would like.
I think they're used to it. In a way, the problem is if you're a designer, and Adam will testify, I hope, to this, there's a lot riding on it.
It's the business part.
I know personally a few designers are out there at the moment, the head of houses, and they say that the head of the house, but actually they're on a contract.
Yeah.
And if they don't do well, if the sale figures don't increase, etc., they're out. So if you do a piece on them and you bring them down, you say, well, actually this is whatever it is, and you criticise it, you could cost them their career. So they are sensitive to it for very good reasons, and they're not designers. One has a sort of vision that the house is so and so, and the head designer. You imagine they might have a lot of power within that house. They've been brought in by the parent company, and if they don't perform, they're out. So they have much less power on the whole. It's not true for everybody in every house, but for a lot of those houses, the people at the top of it, are really sort of fearful for holding on to their contract and their career. So they do take criticism a little bit perhaps more harshly than a filmmaker who's kind of making film after film after film and will make film because that's what they do. The designer can lose their whole whole career in it.
And also, in the early noughties, when a designer got a bad review, you'd blame your stylist. I was fired from D&G after 4 seasons because someone gave a bad review in the last season.
It was your fault.
And they blamed me because I was the stylist. So there are lots of ways of getting out of these things and protecting yourself, which is what the designers do.
Yeah, that's true. But I guess, I mean, I was really struck. It was kind of, for me, a little bit, the conversation started with Nick around, I was listening to this interview of a woman who used to be the editor-in-chief of one of the food titles, and it was Gourmet. And she said that any time when she was starting out, when she would review a restaurant, because they have a fierce tradition of food critics, restaurant critics, she had this picture of this kind of couple out maybe for a dinner to celebrate their anniversary, and she felt that she had to remind herself who she was writing for. So whenever she'd sort of feel like she was pulling back from being critical, she had to remind herself who was going to be reading the review. I wonder too in fashion though, it's not clear to me who's reading them anymore, or, I mean, it sounds like they don't really feel that genuine or that authentic for you guys in your students, and you obviously care about fashion. So I guess the question I have is like, who are the stakeholders? Who is it for? I mean, obviously we said it feels like the gravity's shifted a little bit more to social media. That's where you feel like you can get these opinions, but I don't know, I'd love to hear what you guys think. Where do you go? Where do you go when you want to kind of get up to speed on the shows?
I mean, it's just on my phone all the time, and my phone throws me things that I don't need to see. It's there all the time, fashion, because I must...
Fashion used to be in the form of text, so the Herald Tribune or the Vogue, it's an article.
Yeah.
I don't think that fashion is largely a literature-based culture. I think we're often a vision-based culture. So I think actually people within fashion tend not to read.
Yeah.
Well, the PR does. People at the brands do.
Yeah, the brands do, I'm sure. But
when I was a fashion student, we used to have Fashion Weekly in the UK, which was like a women's wear daily, and it was Adrian Clark, and he would do a roundup of the shows, and I would be obsessed. It was like a pull-out poster, so I'd collect them. I'd always read Susie's copy. I'd read as many of the broadsheets, definitely, because I was really interested in what they thought of the shows, and if my opinions were similar, because I was just interested in Galliano and Westwood and Gautier and McQueen, and that was it. And then apart from that, I wasn't really interested in much else. So it kind of helped me develop a bit of an interest into a broader range of designers, definitely. And then I started to appreciate the work of these designers and stuff.
Now I like to look at the comments underneath posts.
Yeah,
so
really
since you're doing this, you're not actually doing the reviews for each show. The only ones who are doing it are BOF and a few others. And I read the sort of roundup on BOF, but it's the comments in the posts are the most interesting, because they're written by anonymous posters, so they have no fear of any sort of like retribution, and they just say it. And they say a lot of things that you're like, oh, okay, this seems, this could be very contentious, and then it gets, they cross lines, and then it becomes personal to other posters. But I find that there's something really exciting there at the moment. So if I really want to see what somebody thinks about that, I'll just go into the comments and see, and there's always a wide variation of, one post will have a ton of likes, the other one will have almost the same amount of likes, and they will have completely diametrically opposed opinions. So it's like, okay, what's happening here? I mean, the biggest one now is the Pharrell post on that account, and just people saying, he's there because he's continuing the legacy of Virgil before they can change. Others are saying, well, he's there because he's a creative genius. Others are saying he shouldn't be there because he's not a designer, and it's just this massive sort of jumping off point where all these opinions are growing. But I mean, I'm almost 40, so I have a different sort of relationship with social media as somebody who wasn't online when I was young. But I mean, are you looking at the comments and those sorts of things, or is it more like just like influencers in that sense?
Sometimes it's the comments. Like you'll look at a collection, so for example, the Louis Vuitton one, and because if you enjoy what you're seeing, you tend to look at what other people are saying, because you're like, where's everyone's standpoint here? And the comment section is a very brutal place. So once again, you have to take everything with a pinch of salt. So Yeah, I think the influencer thing's a bit of a sticky area at the moment simply because you can be paid to talk and you just don't disclose it.
Yeah.
So it's more you look at the post, you look at what people are saying, and other creatives that you know and you think are well trusted, mostly.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I feel like that trust element's really important, right?
Yeah, but the majority of those awful comments are by someone with 7 followers with a private account.
Yeah.
No context of where this person's coming from.
Yeah.
You know, it just becomes some bitter person in a bedroom spewing fire all day, where actually if you can see who the person is and what their followers are and stuff, I find that more interesting. Also, I think brands really look at these things as well, because it's like, this is direct to market these days with social media. So it's like, you know, what's that bag worth putting on? Was it worth, should we do more bags in a show? Should we show more belts? Yeah. I know when I had a friend that was styling Vuitton, and she did a season where she just used every belt and every bag, and the sales tripled just because there was more belts and bags in the show. And it's that kind of power that I think is quite interesting as well.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, I was having a conversation with someone about this, and they're a stylist as well, and they were saying that the dynamic also between critics has changed a lot, because, I mean, there is actually, I feel like we should give some credit to, like, I don't think they usually take a negative line. I worked at Vogue, I can tell you that there's a rule, it's not even an unwritten one, that you shouldn't be overtly critical. So the idea is that you can discuss the points that maybe that have inspired the criticism, but you don't spell out the criticism. And I think it's a mistake, because also it gives any magazine, and it's not just Vogue, I think most of the magazines and maybe even some newspapers have this as well, because, you know, having that relationship, writing a review gives you access to the show, potentially maybe that gives you access in a different way. There's this kind of back scratching scenario, not just with advertising. I think so even independent reviewers or critics, I've noticed that as they get bigger and bigger and bigger, they get less and less objective, because they have more perks, more interest, more access. There was one that I was really, really interested in, kind of kept talking to him about him to everyone, and then he got a job at a big title, and you know, that sharp kind of viewpoint has just, I don't see it. I mean, probably it's there in the car after the show, but he's not putting it out there. So I think it's interesting. And I guess the question is, like, what's lost by that? Do you feel, I mean, it's really interesting to hear your point too.
I just wondering, do you think it's because in the arts in general, it's whether it's artistically important? In fashion, it is whether it sells. So fashion is about strictly to commerce, you know, and that's the main thing. Whereas in opera or ballet or whatever, it isn't the commerce, it's the art of it. And I think people aren't really criticising fashion on the art of fashion. They're very much about, you know, this is not going to be good for the brand, it won't sell, blah, 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 blah. And they should say it doesn't matter, you know, we should criticise the art of it.
I guess when you kind of see these like crazy MA collections where people put their everything into like making, and they have like no restrictions, they're not like thinking like, you know, should I have a zip with this, or can I have buttons? Because you're not thinking about costs and production and all of that. You're just like able to like go for it and, you know, be crazy, and then they get placed in the brand, and they kind of lose that kind of shine almost, because they have to like think about all these other things, or they're put under pressure to kind of.
I think it's that commerce in the arts, and it's just very much, all the arts are commercial. So it doesn't mean that because you're showing a white cube, it's not commercial, you'll get paid a lot of money. You know, those huge white cube artists and Gagosian and everything are making a fortune, so money is really, really important in that equation. But the fashion doesn't really exist without commerce. It's just there, which is sort of crazy, because it should be. And I think it's those things that hold it back from being recognised as a true art form. And there is that debate, you know, whether fashion is art or not. I believe it is. Other people believe it isn't. And it's the argument usually hinges on whether it's just because it's commerce and that's it. But having worked with, you know, great designers like Lee McQueen, John Galliano, etc., you know, those are genuine artists. I mean, there's no two ways around it. So I think it's a fairly unpleasant relationship between commerce and the arts in any case, and I think it's very much more upfront in fashion. And I think to some degree, these big houses are money-making machines, and that's what they care about. They don't care about the art of fashion. They care about whether it sells or not. And I think that's not where I'm coming from to fashion. I come from the art of it, especially in image making.
Interesting. I don't know, I mean, I'd be curious to hear from you because you're a women's wear designer, right? And do you feel like, do you take on, like, how do you think about criticism? Or is it even part of what you think about for yourself when you're creating?
Like, according to my personal experience, I graduated from Central St. Martin in the pandemic year 2020. When I prepared my graduate collection, I was so nervous. Like, what kind of comment?
You were just petrified of the comment section. Yeah.
Yeah. And then it turns out there are no show at all. So I'm actually, like, during the year, I'm really want to read some comment, even like some bad, but it's just so quiet that year.
Do you think people are afraid to be impolite or sort of afraid to offend you if they give you feedback?
Before pandemic, I think I just a bit nervous about the bad feedback.
Yeah. Now you're ready for it.
Yeah. And I feel the whole fashion industry is like become faster because of the pandemic. Also, there's so many things back to digital. I think also affected by that.
That's true. Actually, you're right. I mean, there were definitely some movements. We've talked about this every time we have this discussion, is how much, I think, you can say the industry hasn't changed that much. These things are still kind of, it's very entrenched, but it is changing, it has changed, and I definitely think the pandemic moved that faster. It didn't maybe move in the ways that we thought it would in every way, like we thought it would all go completely digital, but it hasn't. It's gone very heavy back into physical shows. But I think it's fascinating. I mean, coming back to what you were saying about the Pharrell and the kind of comments about that, I wonder, like, does he care? Do you think he cares about those comments?
God, no.
Do you think the brand cares?
No, I don't think the brand cares. I
do?
Pharrell comes from music, so he's probably used to kind of getting.
He did his job. Yeah. He did everything that you'd expect of Pharrell. He had every celebrity, every musician, and that's bags and belts and shoes. That's sales. It's pure sales. That's all it's for. And also, the added thing is the music was incredible because he's a musician. And it was like, that was a really moving thing as well. So actually, whatever they paid him, it's not enough. I think he's done it. It's a great job. He's working with a studio that's probably been there since Kim Jones, some of those people. Even the bag designer is a bag designer that worked with Marc Jacobs. So these people are there already, and it's just steering people's tastes and things.
Yeah, but it's not an easy thing, though, is it?
No.
Look at big interventions. So people like Raf Simons going to Calvin Klein. Some of those designers get sort of put into a post, and they've got a team there. That it doesn't necessarily always gel.
No.
It doesn't. No. It's not always.
No.
I remember Lee McQueen when he went to Givenchy. The pattern cutters and stuff were terrified when Lee got a pair of scissors out.
Yeah.
They were literally in fear of what the man would do with them. It's not an easy mixture. You do have a kind of core team in the atelier, and sometimes the incoming designer will sack most of them, and sometimes it will just work with their own core team and kind of largely ignore them. It's not a happy relationship being forced to. I mean, I can't remember the most recent example, but there was something that happened a while ago, and you might be able to jog my memory on this, but somebody went into like one of those big houses, and it was a real. Didn't fit. Maybe it's
That didn't work. I mean, they still don't have a creative director, as far as I know, at Calvin Klein. I think they sort of put them off having one.
And I think he brought a whole new team in. People gave up their lives in Europe to move to New York. I know a woman on the design team shipped a whole family there, and it just didn't work out.
Well, and also Anne de Meulemeester, that was
that wasn't a good moment.
We were a little critical. I wonder if that particular show. But it's interesting. I think if it doesn't work, I mean, I guess what's missing if we had a more vibrant culture of criticism, to your point, than we do, whether that's in print or online or in the comments. So obviously it's there. I mean, we're talking about it. I still talk about fashion shows with my friends, and we're pretty honest, sometimes not necessarily scathing for the sake of it, but just, you really can, it's out there. I guess, how would the industry look different if it was more dominant, if it had a better place, this kind of actual criticism?
Yeah, but you've got to think what the criticism for, and if it's based purely on sales, that's why the brand cares and the designer cares less, because there are careers based on making success in that brand. It's really the brand that wants to have more sales.
Yeah.
But, you know, the criticism of the art of design, if you actually look at, I don't know, pick any designer, Rafson, say, you actually look at the art of the person and say what they're doing, how derivative it is or not derivative it is, how inventive it is or whatever it is, that sort of criticism is aimed at the designer. You know, and that, I don't know if they get to hear much or get to see much, you know, because you don't notice their work changing, they're just doing it for what sells, and that's what happens. They'll sit down after the shows, I should imagine, perhaps you could help me on this one, they'll sit down after the shows and they'll look at the orders from the different shops. So, okay, so Hong Kong's orders 10,000 units, you know, Canada's only ordered 5, you know, what's, you know, and they'll base the criticism of the show solely on that, and not like, it was so good that you invented a new way of doing a bias cut dress. You know, not there is a new way of doing it, but you know what I mean.
I mean, it's interesting because when I was at GE, we had that sort of mentality. Okay, well, you know, what's selling? Oh, we have, you know, La Roche in, you know, picking clothes for Celine, dressing her for the tour. Okay, fine. So this is working, regardless of, you know, you get one okay review from American Vogue, one better one from British Vogue. So that's how we kind of gauged it. As I've been watching the industry in the last 5 years, the one who really sticks out to me that I don't understand at all why he got fired was Bruno Soleli at Bon Bon. If you look at the numbers, in the last like 2 seasons he was there, they increased their bottom line by 67%.
Well, why did they fire the guy from Gucci? Alessandro, why did he get fired? He was making billions for Gucci.
That's,
but Lanvin's privately owned, isn't it? And I think the owner's a particularly tricky person.
There was a rumor that, you know, that the same happened with
wouldn't
Albert Albers, and
wish
he was
them on
doing quite well
anybody.
for the brand before he left.
Yeah,
but I think his sales were going down. That's
what's
the
the
thing.
Gucci story? What happened with Kelly?
I have no idea.
I don't know.
I don't know. I don't know anything about that. No.
We can only speculate because there's no one giving us the full Monty, if you will. But I think, I mean, it does come back to, like, if a designer only has like a limited lifespan, it's almost like the sell by date. It does feel like that lifespan. I mean, that being said, there are some designers who've been there for a long time, like they're not going anywhere. But usually those are ones that own the real estate, you know, like a Mucha or someone that you don't need. No one's going to push them out.
We're in a new generation where the brands are not owned by the name of the brand. So Yves Saint Laurent does not exist anymore. But the brand Saint Laurent goes on. And it's the same for most of those brands. Chanel, Saint Laurent, Gucci, and all of them, basically, all the big brands are no longer owned by the person who originally started it and was actually the name behind it. And so it's that variation on, you know, what does somebody do with Chanel? They try and mimic what the brand was set up to do and its values, or they go against them. So it's, you know, it's we're in an interesting new era for fashion, if you want, because none of the, you know, there's so few brands which are actually just the real designer.
I mean, I'm really curious to hear more from you because you obviously kind of experienced the criticism coming at you, or felt like it was coming at you. Did it ever feel like it gave you information that you needed, or that you felt like you could sort of take it on as a brand, or as a designer, or as a creative? Or did it always feel kind of like you just had to manage it from the business side of things?
It depended on what the criticism was. Sometimes it was just criticism of things that they didn't like. So then you kind of knew that, okay, that sort of style was something that maybe you really shouldn't investigate as much unless you have a, you know, maybe much better reference point or something else on top of it. I never really got much criticism that was constructive in that way. I mean, not really from a critic. It was more from maybe talking to peers or talking to stylist friends. I mean, I was taught by Louise Wilson, and her critiques are legendary in the sense that they were. Thank you. Her critiques were legendary, but she would be very. She would have positive things to say within them. So, I mean, most of the critiques that I got when I was in the industry, I basically used them to kind of build a roadmap of what not to do. There was one that I got that talked about how much they liked the cut of the trousers, which is like, okay, well, I guess I'll just do some more trousers. But that doesn't really tell you the creative direction of it. You're like, okay, I'm good at that, I guess. So,
but a true artist shouldn't follow their audience in any case. I've got no idea why I said that, but that seems to make some sort of sense. But I think there's somewhere in sort of art theory that, you know, you should do the art you want to do, and your audience should not be part of shaping that art. That's very hard to do, because everybody says, I love what you've just done, it's very hard not to hear that. Or I hate what you've just done, it's very hard not to hear that. But you should, I think, as an artist, follow your own emotions and your audience comes and goes. And I think it's dangerous to follow your audience because they can be very fickle, and also they can hold your progression as an artist back. So if you do a piece of work and everybody loves it, and then you're sick of it and you want to do something else, but that's what your audience has come to you for, and when you don't do it again, they want you to repeat, and therefore you get into this kind of just repetitious cycle, and that's not good for the life of an artist. So it is tricky to kind of keep on, and that's what fashion tends not to allow you to do. It doesn't allow you to develop as an artist. It allows you to make a commercial success, and once you've made that commercial success, you have to keep on making that commercial success.
Also doesn't allow you to make mistakes. It's like nobody's perfect. It's like, God, can you give people a break? You know, like, particularly if it's the first season and you're working with a brand new team of people that you don't know.
I just want to introduce this break time. Yeah. Do you want to take a seat?
Yes,
Get your questions. Rick is a student at Central St Martin's. You're studying journalism and promotion? Fashion promotion, yeah.
Do you want to be very kind and just we've all had to do it? You say hello to that camera and say who you are.
Oh, sure. Hello, my name's Reka. I'm a first-year student at Central St Martin's, and I study fashion communication and promotion.
Thank you very much. Sorry to ask you that.
So Andrew, what were you saying? So yeah, just taking in kind of the understanding of, okay, this is their first.
But there are, the commercial director after the season's up and the orders are in will say, this silhouette was really great, we need to redo that jacket, we need to redo that pant, we need to redo that. And so actually they're watering down your work in a way. And it's almost like you can have these staples, but don't show them, just have them in the sales showroom. Do you know what I mean? You don't have to show something. And I think that's what was good about Tom Ford. There was always something new. It was always like, it felt like you knew what it was, but it was a new version of something. And also, if there was an amazing trouser or dress, you can still get it. It's just that it was never shown. And he was a very good way of editing and having that control over the commercial team, which is a luxury, definitely.
I had a very good conversation with J.W. Anderson some years ago, where he gave me a different sort of his viewpoint on it. He said when he does a collection, obviously, there's a whole lot of thought that goes into it, and it's there for a particular reason, and the colour will change throughout the collection for a reason, the shapes will change and modify, etc., etc., etc. It's a whole thing, it's a whole operatic, or whatever you want to describe it, but it's an ongoing collection. He says what happens is when it goes out there, Naomi Campbell falls over at the end of the catwalk, that's all anybody sees of your collection, or the most sort of flashy piece. And nobody gets why it's there. Nobody understands that purpose of that piece within your collection, and how your collection goes down is basically down to whatever was the most thing that caught the camera's attention more, and it could be one of your pieces, or it could be the model falls over.
But then I mean, there are some designers, and there are people that just are very bad at taking any sort of feedback. I mean, I'm thinking of Eddie. The man is like famously terrible at taking any criticism. Now I'm probably going to get banned for even saying that, I mean, I just think the guy should.
You'll always be welcome here.
Thank you. I just think I understand on some level that it must be hard to read a negative critique. But I mean, I differ a little bit from you, Nick, in the sense that I'm not sure. I think one of the strengths that fashion has, and one of the things that keeps it so relevant, and it changes fast and quicker than maybe, let's say, I come from a visual art background, painting. There's this, this does sort of feel like it's a very slow moving, it's very male, it has this kind of archetype of like what a real artist looks like, and it hasn't changed that much. Whereas I think fashion has changed so much, partly because it's commercial. So I actually I think we differ in this sense, in that I think that attention to your audience can be actually quite powerful, because you're getting this kind of feedback loop, whether it's a critique or not. You're even, whether you're getting their feedback or they're just showing you by buying it or wearing it, there's something incredibly vibrant about that. I think it depends on, I guess, how much that inhibits your creative process as a creative, as a designer. I can see that being a very difficult thing to balance, but I think it keeps it honest a little bit in a way that is harder. As I said, coming from the visual arts myself, it's just, it is a commercial, visual arts are commercial, but there's just a lot of padding around it to keep that sort of old, you are an artist and this is what that looks like. So I'm interested in that.
Hi guys, sorry to interrupt Emily. I just want to introduce Philippa Morgan.
Hi, Philippa.
She's managing director of Not Just a Label.
Join us. You're going to introduce yourself to the camera.
Once you sit down. The camera at the end of the table is where we have to introduce ourselves to. Everybody's standing around the table, which is so the audience knows who you are when you're speaking.
Not a problem. Well, it's lovely to be here. I am Philippa Morgan, the Managing Director of Not Just a Label, which is the world's largest virtual showroom for independent designers, and we also have a fabulous marketplace as well. And I've been there for 3 months. So now you can grill me about Not Just a Label, but that's not the topic today. My feet are under the table finally.
So we've got flowers block. Hello.
Yeah, hi.
We were just talking about, well, we've talked about a lot, but we're talking about kind of criticism where it is. You know, we were colleagues at Vogue, and it was the topic that I feel like I spent quite a lot of my life talking about. But it's interesting because it's just shifted a lot. So, yeah, I mean, there are designers that just can't seem to take that. They just don't have the desire to hear anything critical at all. I think they're missing out, frankly. But I also equally understand why it's hard to hear sometimes. Yeah, I'm looking at you because you've experienced it.
I remember that Hedi Slimane fight where he took out a thing in the New York Times, right? And he wrote "My Own Times."
Yep.
Amazing.
I mean, did you have some inner satisfaction?
Oh, kind of. Just because you put yourself in those shoes, and there are points where, you know, I've had a few collections where I'm backstage and I'm explaining it very clearly what this is about. Yeah. It's not what they write. They didn't. It's just like, come on, that's what it is. I said this 6 times, and you do want to, you know, vent a bit. Sure. So kind of seeing that, I mean, was almost fun from like a secondary point of like, oh, it would be great to do that. But, you know, he's built something amazing, great. I mean, regardless of, you know, personal interest in, you know, if you like it or not, or those sorts of things. So I think there is a certain level where you can kind of start to maybe say what you feel back in that way. But I don't really see it that much anymore. You won't really see it from a young designer, only because I think you have too much to lose.
You guys are starting out on your design careers. Yeah. Do you want to have criticism of what you do? Are you fearful of that, or you think bring it on?
It's kind of a mix of both, because at the end of the day, you need the criticism to try and figure out what you're doing, and if the stuff's going to sell. But at the same time, you kind of want to do what you're doing. Like, as an independent designer, you don't really necessarily want the feedback because you know who you're marketing for and who your target is. So if someone outside that target wants to give criticism, you're pretty unbothered, to be honest. So yeah, it's you want the criticism, but at the same time you want it from certain people. Yeah. Not everyone.
I think any criticism on any level is hard.
Yeah.
Just one has to justify it, you know, okay, this is about my work, it's not about me as a person, etc. Although that's still quite hard. No, because you're in a digital crypto world. So do you get criticism? Is there a sort of critical forum that attacks you or will criticise you or commend you?
In regards to my art, the way I work is I basically might have an idea at 3-4 a.m. in the morning, just go out with it and post it straight away. The next day I might regret it and think, oh shit, I shouldn't. Usually the way I work now is I kind of do what I need to do throughout the day. I might have some sort of, you know, a good day where I'm just creating all sorts of stuff. The next day check it and scrap a lot of stuff. In regards to criticism, I kind of balance it on previous experiences. So, you know, 5 out of 10 times I might have had a lot of criticism and stuff's done well. I've still posted it, you know, and it's got no.
But you have a very direct relationship to your audience because you're working in the NFT crypto world. You know, if it goes straight away, and it is immediate. But also, the NFT crypto world is really, in a lot of people's kind of, they hate it. There's a lot of people who really say NFT to them and they get all upset, or crypto. So did you get all of that? Because I know you started it sort of at the beginning or fairly close to the beginning of that rise of NFT.
I kind of never pushed the fact I'm an NFT artist. I've always mentioned digital artist because once you put them 3 letters in, you know, whatever you're doing, you basically, what does that even mean? An NFT artist, do you just make digital images or are you just selling digital art? So I kind of avoided that, and I kind of don't really answer the question properly when someone asks, give me, why are you getting into this space? I kind of avoid it on purpose.
Yeah.
I just don't answer it. I give a straightforward answer just because I didn't get involved in this space and became an artist. I've always been doing what I've done way before anything digital got involved.
Yeah, because there's not a lot of criticism, sort of good artistic criticism of NFTs and the digital art. You talk to many main gallerists, they'll be kind of like dismissive of it. Well, it's not real art, it's no great, they're very dismissive. Sort of, although now some of the big institutions have started to buy it. I had the pleasure of having a meal with Beeple a couple of months ago, who is, I think, the highest selling digital art. Who is a lovely chap. I mean, really, really nice guy. Very down to earth and very completely aware of what it all means and how it can just disappear, and might indeed have done. So I do think it's a really interesting, because you do have a very strong critical base, but your critical base has to be against everything you do. I mean, it's not used personally, but everything to do with crypto and NFTs in general.
I think a lot of traditional artists who have got in the space, and for example, Damien Hirst, he gave people the option of basically burning their NFT or redeeming the physical piece. So he gave people an option, so that way his audience wasn't, giving him shit for moving into the NFT space. So
no, he managed
still doing what he's doing.
He managed to ride that quite well, I thought.
I thought that was incredibly clever. It's kind of quite Banksy-esque, actually, like the destruction of one's own art. And it really does, it kind of poses the question of, actually, the ultimate critic is the consumer, and where do they place value in the art? And I think there's lots of fashion designers that I've spoken to, in particular Aitor Throop, who says that really he's not creating clothes, it's about communication, actually. It's his collection, it's a consolidation of concepts and ideas and ideals. And sometimes you can have critics and reviews, and probably, I'm sure you've covered the advent of social media being the democratisation.
We mentioned it.
We mentioned it briefly, yeah. But ultimately, those comments underneath an IG post or a review that's locked in, from a publication, may not actually quite understand the vision of what somebody's doing at that moment in time, and then 10 years later actually comes to a point of realisation that was perhaps they were ahead of their time. And I feel like perhaps NFTs might be one of those case studies at the moment.
Also, bad reviews do great things for designers and artists. I mean, I think bad reviews defined like whole art movements, and if without the bad reviews, would they even be interesting? I mean, I'm not sure if Damien Hirst would be that interesting if he didn't have this kind of bad boy image, like those young British artists of that time, like almost were defined by that kind of pushing against the system. So if you're a designer, maybe to your point, Philippa, we can suggest that if you're a designer, probably, getting a bad review means you're doing something right. You're pushing against the system in some way. I don't know.
Well, it's better to have a reaction. Indifference is the worst review.
Yeah, you were saying it for you that because did you graduate like right before COVID, or did you graduate sort of around that time? Is that why you were saying it was quite quiet, as you said, like around the pandemic, because you just didn't have that direct feedback with people? Yeah. But I think it's interesting because also critics are biased, right? So that's the other thing, is that it's not like our lovely AI, well, I guess he's biased, or they are biased as well.
He's biased. Yeah, he's
got his own bias.
We programmed it into him.
But, a lot of the critics are, they're often white, they're often older. I mean, there is a kind of bias in that, and that I think some designers quite rightly point out that the things that they get criticized about are, whether it's like using, integrating streetwear, like all that stuff, it does have kind of racial and class and age and all of those things.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to talk too much around Kanye, but I worked with him for 10 years, and I went through the whole period when he introduced Kim onto the fashion scene, and the hostility against Kim Kardashian, when she was first on there, was really vitriolic, really unpleasant, and then she becomes what we all know her as now.
Vogue cover girl.
Vogue cover girl. Emily, you said something a couple of comments ago, which I wanted just to pick up on. I think it's important. Fashion's quite a unique beast, and it's partly because of its own definition. You're talking about classic art. So, for instance, painters who tend to plough the furrow for all of their careers, and the more they plough that furrow, the more they kind of become respected, because it's their one big idea, and they bring it, and they paint it, and repaint it, and paint it, and paint it. Whereas fashion, by its definition, if you do one thing this season, don't do it again next season. So there's an energy in fashion which I love, which is why I've always recentered my practice into fashion, because riding that sort of roller coaster of, being very fashionable one season, and then you know that somebody else is going to come along and say exactly the opposite thing to what you've been saying the next season, but then you have to go back and then you have to redo it again, not the same thing, but something new. And that sort of, roller coaster of energy is what, for me, has kept my own practice in fashion really exciting, because you can feel when people are slightly bored of what you do, and then somebody else comes along. It's happened to me because I've got quite a long career now. So I remember Dave Sims coming along and Corinne Day and all those guys. And they're doing all the things I don't do, and then you have to. And then we had to go against it and bring in a different fashion current. And it's that sort of, kind of, you can never rest on your laurels and say, actually, this is what I do, and I'm going to do this regardless for the rest of my life. I guess there are some people that do slightly plough that. Yohji Yamamoto, for instance, beautiful, beautiful, beautiful designer and man, very close to my own heart. But he has kind of kept pretty true to his thing, but he has fallen in and out of fashion.
Maybe you have to be prepared to fall in and out of fashion to really...
Yeah. It's not a nice feeling, especially if your only way of knowing whether you're doing a good thing is how much you get paid, and whether you get flown first class anymore or get a decent hotel room anymore, or if you're actually still employed anymore. It's very hard to keep on doing it when you're not producing any money. You can't really just wait for the cycle to turn around and kind of find you attractive again. So, but I like the energy of conflict and the energy of change. And I think that's very motivating in fashion. When I try and talk to people in the arts about fashion, they don't really get that. It's not. That's one of the whole thing of whether fashion's art or not. It doesn't really sort of work in that way. So my feeling is, it is the most exciting art form. But
I feel like there's almost as well like an element of being like, okay, I have to like see how this is going to work on a body and like construction, and because I actually live with a painter, so she'll kind of go off and like lock herself away in her room and like paint these kind of crazy things, and I'll be like on YouTube like how to sew a collar or something like that. It's kind of like, and then your kind of pattern cutting teacher will be like, what have you done? So there's almost like, there's like this element of art, but you kind of need to, unless you're going to have really badly sewn collars as your thing.
But that's if you've got one of her paintings and made it into a design for one of your pieces of clothing, she might take it as a compliment, but it would tie her to the fashionability of your clothing. And that's where artists can feel very delicate about getting into bed with fashion designers, because it can really, mark their careers in certain points. Those sort of artist fashion designer collaborations. Is it Sterling Ruby and
Raf, yeah.
Not that that's an example of it, that's an example of artistic collaboration.
There's a lot of art designer collaborations that have gone well, or maybe not so well. I mean, the fashion loves art because it gives it sort of a sense of permanence and sort of, other, it's like taps into I don't know what, I'd love to know what you guys think. What do you think? What's that about? Why is there that kind of fascination? I'm looking at you again.
I think with Raf, he's quite literal with his relationship with Sterling. It was literally like saw a painting, made a print. Wasn't rocket science.
Not terribly,
But does it tie Sterling Ruby to Raf Simons' popularity within fashion? In some ways, there's nothing worse than the feeling that you're no longer in fashion. You are unfashionable. It's kind of almost the worst.
I think also at the same time, Sterling was making clothes and splashing bleach over clothes, and I think that's where Raf came in and was like, actually, this is quite interesting. Because I'd buy any Sterling Ruby clothes now if I could afford them. I think they're incredible. I just think that they're pieces of art and they're going to last, and it's denim and you can wear it and you can look crazy.
Is there such a thing as unfashionable anymore? Is that a thing?
I don't think so, because it's, at the end of the day, I think with the rise of social media, everything, you kind of wear what you feel comfortable in. So what you might be wearing is god awful to everyone else, but it's what makes you feel comfortable.
Thank you. I'm okay.
So yeah, it's like it's fine.
I agree with you, but I also think there's kind of a proximity, like how close you are to the last time there was an actual trend that everybody was into. So if you're like wearing something from a time when there was real trend, it kind of dates you a little bit. I'm probably speaking
But that's because it's so fragmented now. It used to be that. There used to be a really clear division that what I've got on now is fashionable. Next season it will not be.
I don't think that exists anymore.
I think that's gone.
I think it's almost like now like an irony of dressing like that you were like in the 2010s, like almost that. I've seen a few people doing it in like a kind of ironic way but then it looks like really fashionable, and I'm like,
Because I'm a little bit older, I've seen things come and go a bit.
Mm-hmm.
So the mullet hairstyle used to be kind of the definition of something that's not fashionable. My son has a mullet hairstyle. He looks great. So I'm thinking, actually, it looks great. Like 5 years ago, I thought, mullet's like the worst thing. But I don't know if that's just something that I have because I lived through the first wave of mullets. But does that exist anymore? Is it everything is now kind of, depending on your audience, they'll think different things. It's kind of, in a way, I hope, that unfashionable doesn't exist. But
I think from just observing like students' portfolios and how they work and how they build collections, I think my generation was very much about, if we're picking something from the 70s, we make sure they pull everything from the 70s. And if we pick something from the 80s, it has to be a very clear definition. Whereas,
super literal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Whereas now, it doesn't. The way I've seen work put together and collections put together, it's like, I like that hat from the 80s, I like that from the 90s, and then just start smashing it all together in this collage. In the same way that social media, your feed is all smashed together with all these different ideas, and then things build out of that. I mean, both of your collections were like that. There were backgrounds of your personal cultural touch points, and then just things that were happening. And I could kind of describe them, but they're not very like super clear cut the way that we would have designed, where it's like, it has to, that's not the way they would have done in the 60s, we have to do it like that. It's not quite the same anymore. I think it's quite kind of exciting, because there is that weird sort of like, I do see the 2010s irony coming back up again. There's actually a kid in my cafe this morning with a mullet, so I see that too. There's something interesting there, and I feel like it's maybe, hopefully, going to birth something in the 2020s, because I don't think we have a defined style yet. It's only 2023, so it doesn't really hit till like 24, doesn't it? It's always like year 4 or 5. Yeah, because Demna didn't hit till 2015.
Right.
And the 2010s, everything was just like maximalist, and then suddenly Phoebe, and then him.
Yeah.
I guess like the way that we're consuming fashion at the moment is because we were kind of put on pause in a way, and we couldn't like go to the shops. So like people really kind of delve into like the deep dark depths of eBay, and like kind of picking all these random things, or like going through your mum's wardrobe, and almost that way of picking up random things and like putting them together is probably.
There must be some psychology behind it though, because yes, like fashion is cyclical, but like the nostalgia for the 90s is very much looking back on, this kind of boom time era, this kind of like Britpop cool, kind of like super chilled place, analog life where we were not constantly interrupted and always on. Remember when, Emily, we could leave the office and actually leave the office? So it's often a kind of a multitude of memories of looking back, and I think now is the most hardest time to be a graduate. I think it's never been harder to break into fashion. I think it's incredibly difficult to do that.
I thought it's the opposite now.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because I started my career started back in the early 80s, 1982, let's say, if I graduated from college. And then there was like 2 magazines. There's no access to contemporary fashion whatsoever. And that's why ID magazine and the Face magazine started up, because Vogue, Cosmo, and Marie Claire, and Elle magazine, and so forth, were not at all interested in kind of people of my generation. So that's why those star magazines grew up. But it felt like now you've got so many ways, and indeed Instagram or those social media platforms are your kind of own version of a magazine. They're your own voice, etc., etc. So I would say you're the luckiest generation.
Well, I guess I'm thinking it's now such a deeply saturated market, and I think economically it's very, very difficult. Of course, there are avenues and routes to kind of make it as an independent designer, But just from seeing all of the graduate fashion weeks, there's just so many amazingly talented graduates. And there's quite a few CSM students that have just called me up and said, can I just actually just have a safe space to talk to you? Like, I don't know what to do next. There's almost so many different avenues, and I think it's really overwhelming. And how to maintain yourself economically if you do want to start on your own. Yes, you've got channels to kind of find your audience, but I do think it's incredibly tough. So I've got a lot of sympathy and...
I think the whole system's changing. I think that is good in one way because it provides lots of new opportunity and different ways of doing things. So you don't have to have a catwalk show. You don't have to be brought up by a big brand, etc. All that sorts of things. You don't have to sell 2 million T-shirts or 2 million pairs of trousers, to survive. So there are lots of new opportunities because there are lots of new ways to be invented to do things. What you don't have is the support of the system. So you don't have the sort of tried and tested way of marketing, selling, and creating fashion. Those are sort of gone. So in some ways it's more difficult because you haven't got that support, but the possibilities now and the reach, the touch you have with your audience is incredible. Before, back in the 80s and 90s, when you worked for a magazine, your 12-page story that you poured all your love and most of your own money into comes out, no feedback, nothing at all. Like tumbleweed goes by, because there was no mechanism to get any feedback at all. They had a letters page in Vogue, which I think the editor used to fill in, and there's two or three letters in it, but that's the only feedback you get from doing your work. So I have to go, okay, well I thought it was good, and do you want to do the next one? But now you have that constant sort of feedback loop, which does, of course, shape your work.
You talked, at the start of the conversation, you talked about how you think ad campaigns and photography and ad campaigns should get more criticism. What kind of, from whom, and how do you think it might shape the industry if there were more?
I don't know, but everybody puts a heart and soul into what they do. I mean, all the good ones do. Whether you're a hairdresser, makeup artist, designer, pattern cutter, whatever you do, you do it with all your love, and therefore there should be room for criticism on that. As I was saying earlier on, the fashion imagery is so omnipresent in our world, and yet nobody says anything about it, and most of it is appalling. And that's not due necessarily to the photographer. It could also, having been a photographer who's created appalling work as well, it could be due to the fact that the brief you were given was then changed halfway through. It could be the fact the model wasn't performing. It could be 100 run that you never know. You just see the end thing. So it is something I think needs speaking about, because although, of course, the designers, show their wares, nobody talks about that. The fashion campaigns that come out, especially from the big brands, are so powerful in changing our opinions and showing us what we're supposed to be. Fashion holds up a mirror to ourselves as a society and says, this is what you're supposed to look like if you want to consider yourself part of society. So it's a pretty strong impetus. So I think those, things like fashion campaigns do deserve criticism. I'm tempted to do it, but I'm going to make myself deeply unpopular in the industry if I do. I don't particularly want to be the nasty person in the industry. But sometimes things need to be said. I'd like to think one would do it to help the image maker who's creating the images, just as I would do if they were a personal friend. But, of course, you need to find an independent critic who hasn't got an axe to wield and hasn't got a kind of personal vested interest to make themselves look bigger by descending your work. So that sort of rules me out of criticising my own medium. But I do think there should be that. I'd love to hear somebody criticise, in a good way, the work of Eugene Solomon, the hairdresser. Eugene will work on 2 or 3 huge campaigns this season, very important, just in film actually. But nobody's really reviewing his work. He's a great, talented artist. Why is there no review for that?
I guess there's a difference between a review, criticism, and then call-out culture. Because if we look at what happened with Balenciaga not so long ago, that was like a huge uprising of people calling them to accountability on how impactful and derogatory and negative that particular campaign, I'm sure we all know what I'm talking about here, was. And I think it was good and responsible that they, of course, came to their audience and said that was completely wrong, this is what we're doing about it. So I think there is accountability there, but it's often a shame that sometimes it relies on a Diet Prada audience to deliver that, and that it doesn't actually always come from the established publications within, because they're treading carefully.
Yeah. So what you have is a very, very vicious and very, very effective cancel culture based criticism. So like the Balenciaga campaign and others, they fell foul of a certain set of quite established parameters within which one can communicate in fashion. And they brought the wrath and iron of a lot of people who hate fashion in any case. So they brought a whole moral indignation to the table. But what there wasn't is a set of well-educated critics who looked at it and said, well, actually, blah, 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 who understand how that fashion campaign could have come about, what Balenciaga are actually trying to say, etc., etc., etc. It's a little bit like, this thing we hear about musicians going into courts in America and then some sort of right-wing Christian saying, it's the devil's music and you play it backwards, you can hear whatever it is. You think, you're not really a music critic, are you? You're some nutcase Christian.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit hard that the most vicious critical forum that does exist for imagery and for fashion, etc., actually comes from people who know very, very little about it. But I guess that's just moral indignation that's rife across every area of life.
I mean, you could argue they kind of messed up. You could argue that I don't know that they meant to go where that went, but I mean, I think you're right though that the fact is that ideally it would be great if there was sort of a balanced view and you could sort of say like, what did you mean by that and was this intentional? But obviously because of the scale of the controversy, and I don't think this is the only instance. I'm trying to think of one as recent as that. But he could say, but of course he couldn't say, oh look, well, we were trying to do this and we obviously didn't succeed. Irony is a really tricky thing to get anyway at the best of times, and if that's what who knows, we'll never know. But his stance, and probably informed by the legal kind of side of the business, was just retract, like just pull back as much as you can. I don't know. I mean, I don't really want to sort of speculate too much, but I think you're right. It wasn't particularly, you felt like you couldn't admit, even if you did make a mistake, because you sort of had to apologize and say, okay, I made a mistake, but is that genuine, or was he
the sort
trying
of
to do
subjects that
something
he's
more?
talked about, I guess, are much more easy, also not easy, but they are much more present in art, in sort of painting or in cinema or all that sort of thing. You can imagine a film about that subject, and there are a few. But that's because people respect those art forms. They respect film, they respect painting, they don't respect fashion. And
That's why they did
their
it
problem.
to art, yeah.
Fashion is tricky because it's not considered high culture. Like you're saying, fashion, like film and art, these are well-respected disciplines that have been, practiced for centuries. But fashion is especially tricky, I think, because when it was first starting out, it had this association with women. And so it was delegitimized in a sense. Yes, it was not high culture, but in addition to that, it was something that was traditionally sported by women and made by women for women. So it wasn't something that these critics, these like white men were like writing about in the paper, and it's still something I think we struggle with, is to like, and that's why I think those artists are often brought into fashion houses, and it's like an attempt at legitimizing fashion, which, I question, why isn't it considered a legitimate art form? It's just a bad history, I think, bad reception. So.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I mean, I do think that it's a funny old industry because it's very focused at women. It's very geared towards women. I mean, the predominant amount of money that's coming out of the industry is around women's wear. It's not that there isn't menswear, obviously, but so an industry that's so focused on women, targeted at women, but most of the kind of C-suite is men, or are men, I should say. So it's a strange contrast. It's an odd one, and I think you're right. I think there's that question of like, is it because it's primarily the most money that's in the industry is aimed at women's wear? Is that why maybe perhaps it's considered less of an art form? I mean, it's a really good question.
I think it comes from the sort of history of fashion.
Yeah.
For those reasons, it wasn't taken seriously within business. You say the history of fashion starting from the beginning of the last century, you go through sort of, like 20s, 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, it was still considered something that big business, which was almost completely controlled by men, had no interest in and didn't understand and were fearful of. And also there's a Protestant dynamic here with Protestantism, I can't speak, sees fashion as a sin. It sees it as flashy, as vanity, as always said. My father, who was very much that sort of school, would never consider that he should dress up at all. That would be completely wrong. That would be a sign that he was being immoral almost. that he was sort of indulging his vanity, and that was, So you have quite cultural reasons why it wasn't taken, and it's only really with the advent of Anna Wintour and Bernard Arnault and people like that, characters that came into it in the 1980s, end of 1980s, beginning of the 1990s, which started to say, oh, actually, this little bubble that has been bubbling away for the last sort of 70 years or so, we can make a lot of money if we do this franchise it out, all the things we've done. And then it became a lot more important. I think it had this sort of weird sort of thing. It was for a long time the refuge of fashion image making we talked about, was the refuge of young gay men because they weren't persecuted. I'm doing a piece on it tomorrow actually.
Do you think it still is? I feel like it's
less. I think less. It's certainly less because societies, I hope, on the whole, are more tolerant to young gay men than they were. Back in the 1930s, 1940s, you've got the Nazis, who weren't that tolerant. You've got Christian America, which really wasn't tolerant. Britain, it was illegal to be homosexual. It's not a great area to be in. So a lot of young gay men would find their safe space in fashion. And you have great image makers like Horse P. Horst, Honig and Huene, George Pat Lyons, who were allowed to exist in this sort of bubble. The problem with that is then you get the 1960s and the sort of sexual revolution that happened for 20 years after the pill and before AIDS, where everything gets about sex. Fashion imagery all becomes about sex, and you get Bailey and you get Newton, you get Bourdain, it's all so sexually focused. And at the end of that you get Bruce Weber and you get all the sort of Herb Ritts and you get all of that sort of imagery. It's incredibly sexual. And then all of a sudden you realise that it's drifted completely out of time with what society thinks is acceptable anymore. And then you get the Me Too movement, partly because of that, and partly because there's huge discrepancy between the powers. Any industry which has got power discrepancy, you've got people who will basically do anything to stay in the industry and people who can exploit that. You get the things that gave us Me Too. So I do think that fashion grew up without the sort of force of business regulating it, although of course it was Me Too in business as well. But it grew up slightly out of thing, and then it just got completely out of sync with what everybody else was doing. And you suddenly find yourself where we were 10 years ago, whatever it is, where most of the fashion image makers industry, can't speak today, found himself falling foul of what people thought was acceptable behaviour anymore. Whereas before you were encouraged to get your model to make love to the camera. It's like, A, I always found that revolting, but B, you'd never do that now. It was encouraged to this highly sexualised area. With Fashion Photographer's Studio was incredible. Look at Blow Up, the film about David Bailey's life, or referencing David Bailey. It was all about, he would sleep with the model before she went on set. For Christ's sake, can't imagine anything more nightmarish for Condé Nast at the moment. Photographers behave like that.
I think another issue is that fashion has been it's more reliant on the media. It's been mediatized, and because of that, it's fashion shows and campaigns have become a bit of like a spectacle for the internet. So I find it really difficult to separate the clothes from the space, from who's sitting at the front row, and therefore it's hard to come to a conclusion of what you're actually criticizing. It's really difficult.
Well, there was a little event only in Paris yesterday at Louis Vuitton.
We've discussed. There we go.
It's entertainment. It's like the reviews are probably 20 to 30% about the clothing, and the rest is about the actual cultural event that it was.
But that's
like
meme
design,
culture, right? I don't think that's an accident. That's not.
No,
definitely.
That's smart.
It's a direction that the brand has taken
I think
because
that's
they know how.
Very smart.
I say every 10 minutes it's about selling bags and shoes.
I remember Matt Williams, who has the brand Alix and now is the head designer at Givenchy, and when he was at Alix, it was a new startup brand, and he said when Asap Rocky took a selfie with his belt on, sales go through the roof.
Yeah.
So you can see why these brands kind of want to court celebrity because it works for them.
Speaking of, should we ask Avery Grace something?
What's a good pertinent question?
Well, I think Vuitton, let's lean into it. Maybe we can even get some Web3 in there. We could talk about the trunks. I don't know. What do you guys want to ask our AI fashion critic? Just to bring you up to speed, Philip.
I mean, I would love to know, going back to the point about...
Abby's here, can hear us actually.
Is the fashion industry classed as a derogatory part of culture because it's vain? That's might be a bit too much for him. Let's find out.
You're waiting.
Shall I reword that? Because it's interesting because what we were talking about, just 5 minutes ago, to me that's quite a Western perspective. I actually think that there's great pride is taken in Middle Eastern culture and in Southeast Asia, China, as to what one wears, and that is seen as highly credible and showing self-respect.
Or even Italy, France, the Catholic countries, they don't have a problem.
No, there's nothing. Yeah, it's totally unapologetic. It's an intrinsic part of your character and your life experience, and a businessman in a suit.
But how much has Asian perspective been put into the mainstream fashion industry? That's, I think, our problem. You've got an industry which is driven in part by North America and Britain, which are Protestant cultures, and in part by Italy and France, which aren't. So those are your sort of main players. There's very, very little. I mean, more when the Japanese came.
Here we go.
It's associated with vanity. Fashion
can I see?
can be seen as an art form, and like any other art
could you
form,
possibly ask Abby to pop
unique
through?
set of values and principles.
He'll speak a bit
It's
louder.
true that some aspects of the industry
Hi, Abby. Young Evie Grace is answering a question. I've got no idea who's answering a question. Who's answering a question? Could you turn the volume up so I could hear his answer? And also, could we ask him a specific question? Because he might be just asking a general question from the public.
individuals, and it's up to
Is it
each
okay to say he's
person
quite
to
good
decide
looking?
how they want to
Is that coded in?
You can ask him if he's single if you want. He does know whether he is or not.
That would be weird.
Okay. We were doing this the other day, and I can't remember who it was, but one of the guests at the tea party, Abby was sitting where you're sitting there, typing the questions in. Yeah, and he was shouting at Abby as if that was kind of Alexa. Unfortunately, we haven't quite got to that
That
stage.
does sound like my ex, so maybe.
By the way, this is very much an open forum, so if you need to leave, I don't want anyone to feel like they have
Oh
to
yeah,
stay.
I might.
Yeah,
It's lovely to see
especially
you.
for the early drivers. Yeah, but you can come and go as you need, so I feel like they can't do that, but you really can. Thank you so much.
And please eat some sandwiches before they get too bendy.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming.
There's real art to eating sandwiches on camera. Let greed take over and let my editors deal with the problem, don't worry. We used to do this thing when we had the panels, when we started doing the panels in 2010 roughly, where we'd put alcohol on the table.
Oh, Lord.
That's not such a great idea.
That's such a great idea.
Not such a great idea. Some very, very well-known fashion journalist who I love just overindulged. And by the end of it, she was on the floor, quite literally.
I mean, it's entertainment.
It was.
You've got a question.
Oh, yeah, let's ask another one. That was a good one, Philippa. Anyone have a question for you?
Did it answer your question, Philippa?
Yeah, he doesn't think it's necessarily associated with vanity.
Oh.
So
Yeah, okay.
he thinks it's an art form.
All right, let's ask something about Vuitton. Let's see. Do we think that, does Eber Grace think that the new direction of Vuitton will, what?
Helpful or correct?
Be helpful to the brand. Let's just start with the brand and we can branch out. Did you get that, Abby?
What did you say, sorry? Vuitton.
So the show today. So the new direction under Pharrell, is it going to be positive for the brand? I feel like that was a pretty vanilla question, so we might get a really vanilla answer. But while it's thinking, he's thinking, I want to ask you a question about, because I think it's interesting, you were saying when you first started, you kind of introduced yourself, you said that you felt like there were a lot of kind of Web3 or digital artists that are kind of interested in fashion. I kind of want to know why. Like, why is it that, why do you feel like that's attractive for people who are working in that space?
Do you mean brands getting into the space?
Oh, sorry, hold on.
I'm actually quite happy to see it to be He's a multi-talented individual and has been known to be very innovative and forward-thinking in his approach. I think his vision for the brand will be fresh and exciting. Only time will tell if it will be positively received by the fashion industry and consumer alike.
was hoping he was going to check share prices.
He's a little bit nice at the moment. Give me another season.
Sure. So yeah, sorry, please, yeah. So did you? I was asking why is that so many digital and kind of Web3 artists and creatives are kind of interested in the fashion space in the first place?
I think fashion and Web3 hasn't really worked yet properly. So there's a lot of digital clothes coming in, and people are making digital skins and stuff like that. It's the same as basically you playing these games online and you buying skins for your characters. So what people are doing now is they're kind of making outfits and dresses and stuff like that. There's actually I think I've seen a video outside did the Institute of Digital Fashion come in?
They came in last week.
They came in, yeah. So what they're doing, they're creating digital assets. Everyone's basically preparing for a digital world because the Apple headset's about to come out, so they want the character to be wearing the best clothes and stuff like that. And then the other thing I personally think it is the pandemic. So people are basically, getting involved in this space now to prepare for another pandemic, because everyone's going to be indoors for another. If it does happen again, people are still involved in the space. They're preparing for the next one.
Really? Or do you or is it that? I'm sure is a factor. Do you think that it was also just that people had a lot of time to kind of develop that aesthetic while they were indoors? Or maybe a bit of both.
I think because everything's so accessible these days, one YouTube tutorial you can get involved in anything you do, and I think a lot of people had time, and the accessibility factor was two big things. That's the reason the pandemic for me was probably the best year of my life, just because if I wasn't on Twitter at a certain time at 3 o'clock in the morning, I wouldn't have seen a post about an NFT and wouldn't have got involved in the space.
Wow, so you practice what you preach.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Amazing.
But it is this world that Newman describes, it's this virtual world, and we are going to have self-image in it. So we are going to have to decide, just as much as we decide for this world what we want to wear, what we want to wear.
Yeah.
But of course we have much more, needing to obey the laws of gravity, or pattern cutting, or needing to stay the same. My suit could change gentle colours.
It's very psychologically freeing, actually.
Sorry?
It's psychologically freeing. And I don't know if you've seen the film Ready Player One.
Yeah.
Right, to me that explains why NFTs and fashion are happening. My kids play Fortnite. I think it's only a matter of time before everything is to a certain extent gamified. And I do think it's this really exciting dawn of true self-expression in the metaverse, in Web3, and actually designers are able to actually create scale in their collections, or like what Gary James McQueen did. It's probably one of the first strongest metaversal collections. I think that was 2020, 2021. And that was fascinating, but there are certain fabrics or like liquid looks that you just can't necessarily, like as a young designer, might not be able to afford those fabrics. So again, it democratizes access.
You guys look so fresh. We're all a bit wilted.
Roasted hair.
No, it is very warm in here. We're having a kind of it's like Greece in here, Nasia.
Would you be very kind, and we're asking everybody to do this, just to say your name and who you are to the camera at the end of the table?
Here, yes. Hi, my name is Nasia. I'm a writer. I've written for Financial Times, Vogue, Days, and others, and I'm a model. I've worked for Balenciaga, Dior, Prada, and yeah, I'm very excited for today.
Do I need to lean forward as well?
You don't have
to.
Hi, I'm Daniel Peters. I'm the founder of the Fashion Minority Report. We do a lot of work to create more inclusivity in the fashion industry for marginalised people.
Amazing.
Lovely to have you with us.
Yeah. Okay, I don't need to bring you up to speed, but we have talked about the Louis Vuitton show. We talked about. I'm ready. We can circle back. We talked about AI and Web3 and fashion. We talk about fashion criticism, its lack of sort of objectivity, and the kind of new version of fashion criticism, which is sort of everywhere and everyone. And I think now we had a little conversation with our AI fashion critic, Iberi Grace, who is, as you said, quite elegant, quite dapper, quite
They're being a bit polite.
easy
It's
on
the
the
first season. They haven't really found their feet yet. Don't get a bit bitchy.
They're finding
it.
Yeah, but I mean,
It's very hard to program an AI to get that right level. If you program them, because it's a slider that says ironic or sarcastic or amorous or flirtatious, and you set the slider. So it's not quite programming as you might imagine, it's a bit more simple than that. But it is something you have, when you're creating an AI, you have to create their character. And it's really this very odd thing where you're creating, but we had to find their voice, we had to find a name for them, we had to find their tone of voice, etc., of course, and the knowledge that goes into them. But yeah, it's a tricky thing finding their character. And at the moment, we've gone for polite. That'll change. We weren't going to do it so it would randomise it. But I thought, no, that's like living with somebody you never know how they're going to answer you. Because if we randomise it and they're being polite, the next time they're being amorous, and then they're being blunt, that's not good at all.
Please may I come back when it's sarcastic day?
Amorous is great, sarcastics are nice. I had it on sarcastic, and I said goodbye, and he said, yeah, goodbye, don't let the door bang you on the way out. Okay. So it's not nice. You think, okay, it'll be fine, but it actually blunts the worst.
Yeah.
Speaking of blunt, what do you think about fashion criticism? No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I know I do that in here.
What do you do?
It's like, you don't have to do that. I'm like, let's round it back to fashion.
That's
no,
good.
I'm joking. Yeah, but we touched on the show, and it sounds like you have something to say. Would you love to share your view on the Vuitton show? What did you think?
I mean, I think firstly on the subject of criticism, I think something I noted down for myself is that we're policed these days in terms of what we can say because of fear of the repercussions. And I think when I think about that with a layer of diversity on top of it, if you're a woman or if you're ethnic minority, there's probably even more of a fallout potentially if you say something. So I'm probably going to put my words quite carefully or considered.
Sure. Fair enough.
I think the show was interesting, but it was more of a spectacle. It was much more of a vehicle for publicizing this machine. You've got Beyonce, you've got Rihanna, you've got Jay-Z, you've got everybody, not just sat on the front row, but also walking in the show. And I think from that perspective, it makes me question, to some extent, have they brought Pharrell in for the hype, or is he there to create hit collections? Because, to be fair, I lost track of what was happening in the show. The music was incredible. But I think I got lost in the music and didn't pay quite as much attention to the collections because there were also so many themes kind of in amongst the show.
Yeah.
So it didn't necessarily feel as ground perhaps as some others could. But
I think, to be fair, you're completely right. It's a sensitive subject. It's kind of what we were saying earlier. It's hard to know where the line of being critical and where it's helpful, useful, and important. But I think, I wonder, because Vuitton has always had a tradition, at least for the ready-to-wear collection, of always making the show the spectacle that sells Andrew was here earlier to sell the shoes and the bags. I think it's primarily, I haven't seen the numbers, so I don't know for sure, but it's led by its accessory sales, and so the clothes that are, this kind of sail that pulls the rest of the brand. And so it's really interesting that in that sense, it makes a lot of sense, the collaboration, the appointment of Pharrell. I was going to say collaboration.
But it does feel like a collaboration to an extent.
Yeah, it does actually. What about you, Nasi? What did you think?
I didn't quite watch the show, but so I saw it from social media, and I have mixed feelings because on one hand, I'm thinking, should we give opportunity to people who not necessarily come from a fashion background or have studied fashion to do something creative and something interesting? And this is what Virgil kind of did, and it's a successful formula. On the other hand, so like the purist inside me is like, but shouldn't we give opportunity to someone who actually knows fashion, who has studied Vuitton and the rest? But on the other hand, I agree completely with what you said. Louis Vuitton is one of those brands it makes sales from their accessories. Like we all know the bags. It doesn't make so much money from the beauty. It's purely the bags. So yeah, why not create like an amazing spectacle, an amazing event, which a fashion show is an event in the end of the day, and just make more money. Get the bag, literally.
Or the virtual, or the metaverse trunk. Yeah, we were talking about that earlier and how much those are going for. So it's quite remarkable in that sense. But yeah, like I mean, I don't know that Pharrell cares that much if he gets negative criticism in this case. Do you?
Yeah, you do.
Do you?
Yeah, I mean, it depends how Pharrell sees it. I think what it is almost certainly is they want to sell more stuff. And however they'll sell more stuff, they'll sell more stuff. And Virgil kind of broke the what people expect of a designer and changed the game up. And so I think that makes the entrance to someone like Pharrell much more sort of, not expected, but much more possible. But I think that ultimately they're about selling. And that's a little bit of the conversation we were having earlier on. There's a lot of us, I think, around this table come from an idea of the art of fashion and not the selling of fashion, whereas the brands are really about the selling of fashion. So they don't really care if it's, I'm not saying bad fashion or ridiculous. I just think, because...
By the way, you can get up and leave at any time. I feel bad that I should say that, but it's not a panel by design. So if you need to, thank you so much for coming, guys. I mean, you can stay, but you can also go. So it's really to you. Thank you.
Do take a sandwich.
I'll take the whole thing.
Sorry, I got distracted by that commotion, but yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting moment. So you think he would mind because it?
Thank you so much.
You think he would mind because it would have an impact on the way the brand is seen?
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, he's a very well-dressed young man, and he's a very good musician. He's used to criticism on his music. His music has a good critical forum. He might not be so used to the sort of criticism he might get because it'll all be based on sales. But yeah, I think it would hurt him if he said, "Oh, these clothes don't look exciting or derivative or whatever." Of course, that would hurt him. Just as a human being, that would be. He wants to do his best job.
Exactly. But I think to that point, he is a human being, and we're all impacted by negative criticism or commentary. You know, he's had that recently with, or from Khalees, for instance, about the part of the track on Beyonce's album being used, and she didn't give the rights, and so on and so forth. So I'm sure that affects him in some ways.
Yeah.
But he's able to build a kind of wall around him that to some extent won't or can't be penetrated. But at the same time, you know, if the product doesn't sell, he will be.
It's a direct feedback.
Yeah, exactly.
Work in
That's
a way,
so true.
which is a bit sad, but at the same time, just to add on what you're saying, I find the topic of criticism a bit sort of like difficult because sometimes you can't make decisions on your creativity and the work that you want to put out based solely on criticism, because you know it's again I think it's like it's an attention or like a focus problem. It's like, you know, if you on the internet, if you want to find a negative view, you'll find a negative view. If you want to find a positive thing, you'll find a positive thing. So sometimes it's good that everyone has access and they can sort of like say the view, and yes, they can form their own opinion, but in the same time, it's just the oxymoron of choice, no? There's like so much choice that, you know, you can, as a creative, you can get sort of like lost in the sea of like opinions and styles, and you're like, okay, so what do I do? So you have to, at some point, not care. Also, like, you know, it's quite the Epicurean sort of like philosophy that, you know, you want...
Pretty good. Yeah. I'm actually just about to go, but very nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
I'll leave you guys to. I've just been here since the beginning, so I feel my voice is a bit too present in this discussion. But
thank you so much. Oh, walking out, that's good. That's good way to bring it in. Hi. I kind of agree with you, actually. We touched on this a little bit. Like, we were just talking about kind of criticism and like as a creative. how you take it in or not, or how you engage. We're talking about the Vuitton show and how he may or may not. My temptation, I think if I were him, or if I were someone in that position, I think my temptation would be not to pay attention to it.
Exactly.
Because you kind of think, well, I've made that decision for lots of reasons as a creative. But then I guess on some level, you know, we're in an industry where there isn't a really vibrant sort of culture of criticism. It's sort of, as you said earlier, you feel like even on social media, which really was the platform where you feel like people should, and people do take liberties and say what they think. But you know, you feel almost that there's this, you shouldn't or you can't, and some designers and some creatives take it very personally if you criticize their work, understandably. But I think that sometimes we're sort of missing something if there isn't some feedback loop.
You need some objectivity to be mixed into the conversation. It can't just be purely positive about somebody's work, because actually, what does that do to push boundaries or to move things forward? Actually, it creates limitations. But I also question, actually, with this, how much we're actually critiquing Pharrell's work or the team's work. Because actually, I don't imagine Pharrell, you know, we saw 40 people come out at the end of that show, which was great to see. But equally, what were all of their roles and what was Pharrell's role in this entire production of the collection? Music, you know, admittedly Zoe's going to be that, but you know, did he then just set the tone and the direction for the collection at the beginning to then dip in and out and to see how things fit and look, as opposed to being there for every single fitting, pinning, draping, sketching? Like,
It's a really good question. I mean, does anyone know? Anyone have any insights? I don't know, I'm looking at you. You've just got this twinkle in your eye that like you do know something. But I mean, equally also, is one of the things we touched on earlier, like fashion criticism specifically. So magazine, I come from a long time working in magazines. But it was, you know, the critics were mostly white. They still are. They're mostly a certain age, and they're not necessarily, and I do think some designers have been criticized unfairly, or certainly through the lens of race and class. So I think sometimes that's also the question, is like, who's the criticism for? Who are the critics? Who's in the position to be a critic? I mean, obviously now with social, it's everywhere. But then one of the comments, I think it was Nick that said this, is like, actually where you can really get interesting stuff is in the comments. But then I think, I was like,
quite nasty.
Yeah, I think
some
it's
people are mean.
Yeah, some trolls in the comments as well. So I guess that's kind of the point of this conversation. I'd love to hear from you guys and see sort of what you think.
I think it's really interesting that you just mentioned that Nick said that the most interesting place is in the comments, because the thing that sprung to mind was that actually fashion criticism kind of has lost its historical value, and what has taken its place is discourse. Because you actually do have access to seeing the collections actually when they're happening, and everyone can see them at the same time, and everyone can discuss them at the same time and make their own opinion. Whereas previously, fashion critics were there to sort of break down the collection and bring it to sort of the masses of, this is what you're actually looking at. But we're in an era of fashion where actually everyone has access to fashion immediately when it comes out, and everyone has an opinion, and some of these opinions actually are quite informed. So I think it is interesting to think about the fact that actually where you actually get those discourses is in the comments, because you do actually have people who are engaging with this show and taking the time to actually invest in what this work actually is, whereas the fashion critic actually might be going from so many shows that actually you don't really have that much to say anymore.
You're just giving a kind of snapshot.
Yeah, totally. Totally.
No, I completely agree with that, actually.
And also, like, referring back to the Louis Vuitton show, I think sometimes, even now, it's like often more about the show than the actual clothes themselves. Because like the show was so big, like I didn't even really see the clothes, and I was like going through I was going through the images, and I was like, actually, like, do these clothes even stand out, or is it like even like a copy of something that's already been made? Especially with the Minecraft prints, it's like maybe at Lower Ver you've already seen this kind of glitchy effect they made on the clothes in their last collections. So yeah.
So very good. I actually forgot. So for you three that have just joined us, would you mind introducing yourself to the camera? I know it's a little cringe, but if you could just, because I just made these guys do it. They're probably sitting there going, made us do it, but why did they? So yeah, just if you could just say your name. Yeah, to the camera.
Hi, my name's Hannah, and I'm a student at Central St Martin's, and currently a 3D design intern at Zydrobe next to university.
Thank
And I'm Sophie Stalder. I'm also a student in fashion communication and promotion at Central St. Martin's, and I'm also a junior 3D designer at digital fashion brand Drop. So yeah.
Thank you.
And I am Jawara Aline. I'm a fashion designer and lecturer, tutor, et al.
I love et al. I'm going to start saying thank you for that. Sorry, I feel very headmistressy when I ask that, but just to bring everyone up to speed. But yeah, I mean, I think you're right. It feels like it's certainly, fashion criticism is everywhere. And to your point about it being a spectacle, I actually think that's what people are more interested in. Let's be really honest. I mean, the days of the kind of very, whatever purist fashion show is, I think that's, I don't know, it just doesn't feel as, that's just past. I mean, there are some designers that still do it and do it beautifully, like I'm thinking Yoji, and it's always like just a plain runway and just the lights and hardly any music or like the sound of like this is the music, you know, like literally.
But even this is spectacle, no?
Yeah, in a way it is, because you're
the absence of sound, the absence of stimulation, it's still a spectacle.
And having been on that circuit of going show after show, you're absolutely right. You get this kind of snow blindness where you can't see the wood from the trees. My role was never to be a critic per se, but I felt like for those, I mean, they take their craft very seriously, right? So I think we have to give them some props. And I think there might be some almost more need for that contextualization now than there ever has been, because there's so much criticism out there or discussion out there that doesn't necessarily always have the viewpoint of, you know, that kind of root in history. So in that sense, I think they're needed. And you know, it's great that there are more voices out there, but I guess it still sort of feels very safe, like it's playing it safe sometimes. Certainly magazines and newspapers.
But it's like, you know, you look at food critics, they have their place and they speak authentically about the food and the experience and ambience that they get when they go to a restaurant. And not that they're mean, but it's honest and it's critical for the purpose of actually somebody's going to go here and spend money, in the way that an old Vogue editor recently spoke about the now outgoing Vogue editor. But I found that incredibly critical when it came down to race and diversity. And when I looked at the commentary from people who followed the ex-editor, you know, people were trying to tiptoe around their kind of inverted racism. Oh, this isn't for me anymore because, you know, it's for so many diverse people and that doesn't fit me. And it's just kind of like, criticism has its place, and I think we should always be able to look at something objectively. It's when the criticism goes to a place where it becomes damaging that I think that it spills into a need for it to be more considered. And again, if a food critic can do it, why can't we talk about clothing and the people behind the clothing in that sense more objectively?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. Actually, part of the reason I wanted to talk about this subject is I heard an interview with the Old Gourmet editor-in-chief. And I'm sorry I said this earlier, but I'll say it again. She used to have a picture of this kind of couple going out to a restaurant in New York City for their anniversary or something, you know, they'd saved up or whatever, I mean. But that was in her mind. So she sort of knew who she was writing for. I think it's really hard to know. I feel for critics now because they don't really know who they're writing for. I mean, it's like, is there an audience out there? I mean, I'd love to hear from you guys. You haven't graduated, you're still in that sort of space. I don't know if students are really looking to it in the way that I certainly did when I was studying. I'd love to, you know, hear your perspective on that. Do you look at fashion criticism, or does it inform sort of how you think about?
I think we look at fashion, I mean, speaking for myself, I look at fashion criticism, but I also take it with a pinch of salt, and I also consider what is the context that they're speaking about. Are they talking about something that's digital? Are they talking about a runway show? Are they talking about an editor-in-chief leaving somewhere? So that is important as well. And I think sometimes some criticism, as I can't remember who mentioned earlier, is they're not so well equipped because it's moving at such a fast pace that sometimes it's almost better to turn towards another form of criticism, whether it's an art criticism in the sense of, for example, the digital, because they're more equipped to be understanding what they're talking about because they've studied it and they understand it better, or sometimes independent critics because they don't have that sort of weight of the advertising.
Yeah, and I think, and also at university is like we think we like have crits every few weeks. Like it's kind of part of the curriculum for us to like look at everyone's work, tell our opinions, and I think that's kind of deliberate that we, you know, will be very, very draining. We'll have to like go for a whole day of like looking at everyone's work and speaking about it, and we're like, oh my god, like it's 4 o'clock, it's boiling, and we want to leave. Yeah. But it's necessary for us to kind of, because it's one thing that we learn from what we need to like even improve or what's good or bad about our work, but to look at what other people are doing, you know, and what they need to improve in, or yeah. So
I wonder if maybe even just calling it criticism is like a slight mistake, because criticism just by nature, you're like, you know what, I've got a critique for you. You're going to be a bit like, okay, because you don't. I mean, I'm thinking like the people who've changed my mind about something, or even about myself, or about the way I've approached things, have never done it in that way. Mm-hmm. So if I put myself in the position of a fashion designer or a creative that's making a collection that I put a good amount of my love and attention to, and looking at you, I don't know that. I mean, what I would love is someone to say, you know, someone you trust to give you their perspective in a way that you know is for your best good, even if it's hard to hear. So I think that you just reminded me, like maybe it's the criticism, like actually just calling it criticism, because we have this almost the tradition of debate and criticism, which is very Western, it's very colonial, it's very like here, you know. And so in a way, it's like just that idea of it being criticism is maybe that's part of the problem. Maybe we need to your point, maybe it's you guys are already switched on to the fact that the advertisers are having a big play into it. So what is the point then? Why maybe we just need to approach it differently, call it something different. I'm not sure.
I think I think something that I considered for a bit is like who you have to turn to for an opinion and who you have to turn to for advice. You know, for advice you might go to someone that's closer to you, that understands like what you're into and what you're not, and they might give you a reference that you really enjoy. Whereas for an opinion, you might turn to a different person that's going to tell you maybe aesthetically, you know.
But criticism as a whole, you mentioned that it's sort of becoming obsolete in a sense where you're not the critics writing aren't sure who they're writing for, but I think we're viewing criticism as text, and that's always been so connected. And when we think of criticism, we think of literature, something written, but in reality, criticism can be a reaction to anything. It can be an informed reaction in the form of art, it could be a film, it could be something you say, you're literally your facial expression, your body. I think thinking about it in that way can help harness it more, make it relevant for today, because people aren't reading fashion criticisms on Vogue. Like I don't know what they're called. I'm sorry. I hate to say that, but it really is a matter of rethinking what criticism is, like you're saying. Yeah.
And I think it really also depends on where you are at the industry. I think for us is because we're so early, you know, we're all first year students, it's sometimes you don't know how much criticism you should actually take, because, you know, you're still not sure about yourself, what you want to do, what kind of work you want to put out there, and how much advice you actually take from your tutors or even peers, and how much when hang on, actually, you know what, like I love doing what I'm doing and I'm just going to continue doing that. But because like you're still very unsure of yourself, often it's very difficult to balance that out, I think.
Adding to what you said, I think also you should choose your critics, but also you should choose your enemies. Like you don't want to be liked by everyone. You want some people to not like you. Yeah. It's actually reassuring because it means you're in a different path and you want to separate yourself from something that doesn't sort of like feels like you. So like we talk about criticism, but sort of like obviously has like a negative connotation, but in the same time, your enemies are very useful because you want to be separated. You don't want to be, you know, like someone who doesn't sort of like express what you know, or has the same ethics.
Yeah,
that's a really good point. I mean, I'd love to hear from you because I know you know you're in it. You're making work. Do you feel like criticism resonates for you, or do you feel like you have to kind of keep the people around you like a counsel that will give you feedback?
I think both are true. I think for me, I don't know, I've had a kind of difficult relationship with criticism being used as a space for just giving me anxiety, actually. Like truly, when I did my first show with Fashion East, it was in COVID, and it was just something that went live online, and there was nobody around me. So there was so much pressure of what people are actually going to say, because that's the only reaction that you can get, because there's no one live. There's nothing in person, and the only feedback you get is what's written about the collection. The feedback has always been...
Well, that's making me anxious. Just
so much anxiety, so much anxiety. The feedback has always been good, but just the space of sort of looking to this feedback as the sort of penultimate reaction that you get for the work that you've done, I think, is not necessarily the best course of action for how you sort of value your work and measure your work. But sort of going through that process, I think for me, what I find to be interesting is that I do think that there is value in criticism, because human beings, we have a very short memory span, and there's a lot that actually happens even in just 1 year in fashion, right? And usually the fashion critics have been around for a really long time, so they've seen the history of where we're coming from, etc. So I think there is a value in even sort of the designers that I used to look up to. A lot of those writers are still writing, so I do value their opinion. But for me, I think the relationship that we have with the way that information travels has changed, but we haven't updated a lot of the way that we write about and talk about things systematically. And I think that's really where the problem is. It's not that there's anything wrong with criticism, it's just that there's so many other ways of critiquing a work, and there's so many other valuable sort of ways of digging into what the general public, and also just the general public also having an opinion. I think sometimes it's a new thing, right? And it's happening, and it's like happening right in front of you, and sometimes actually you get their opinion before you even get the critic's opinion.
They don't love that either.
No. But hey, it's instant. The shows go up, comments start rolling in. You know, I think there's a disconnect systematically with where we actually are in society, and how the things that we hold to be valuable, so valuable that we refuse to break and shift and how these things actually function within society. I think fashion discourse is extremely important. I think it's important for a large range of people to be a part of these conversations, because fashion collections are not just being made for audiences that look a particular kind of way. So sometimes actually it's more valuable to hear what the people in the streets are saying about your work, because that's really who you're speaking to.
And they don't have a vested interest.
And they don't have a vested interest. It's just, they just say how you made them feel. And I think that is quite valuable.
I mean, another factor, because I think certainly we've got, that's very fascinating to hear your perspective on it. I think it's interesting because also you have another layer. I mean, it's always been there probably, but it's always been kept quite separate, which is, the critique on brands for being or not being sustainable or not being circular. And that's another, it feels really interesting because I work in that space. And it's fascinating to me to see this other layer of critique based on different parameters and often within the fashion world, on one hand, it's like this cultural mirror, it's a cultural reflector, but on the other hand, it's very insular. It doesn't change it doesn't change that much in some ways. And I think there's resistance to, they talk a good game, but there's a real resistance to really taking that criticism on. We've had this conversation before, I think, but so there's different layers of it. It's coming from different directions, to your point, right? And about different things. And I almost get this feeling that the fashion is just kind of like battening down the hatches. It's rather than sort of saying, okay, what would we like fashion criticism to do? What would we like criticism about? Who would we want to empower to have a voice in this kind of criticism? How can that change the industry for the better? That kind of thing. I still feel like it's a very us and them sort of model.
Which it shouldn't be.
Yeah, it seems like it's a lost opportunity, I guess, to your point. Actually, before I say anything more, would you mind introducing yourself to the camera? You can just look right over there.
So I just introduced a bit, right?
Yeah, just say your name and
my name is Ziwei Qu. I'm the designer and founder of Yatomic, which is a menswear clothing brand. I was study menswear in LCF and graduate masters in Central St. Martins.
Brilliant.
Thank you
so much. Thank you. Oh, that was very efficient. I'm on. But yeah, so you also have an experience of I don't know if you've had an experience with having fashion
Yes,
criticism?
yeah, actually this topic is very interesting for me personally. It's dragged me back into when I remember I just released my first collection, which is based on my graduation design. And I received an average 3 to 4 stylists borrowing clothes for a week. So for celebrities and magazine shoots. So, and I thought my collection would succeed in some certain extent. But at the same time, I also received criticisms from all sides, including my family and my friends.
Oh, that's the worst.
The worst thing. I have to have a very strong heart to handle it. So, so who said that the clothes would not suitable for general public, and the clients were not gonna pay for the clothes, and my brand was not suitable, and so on, and also like they would not worn every day. So when I heard these criticisms, just dragged me back to the reality. Yeah, you know, you just I'm school girl, then graduate. Yeah. I think they tell me in some ways it's the truth, right? So I feel that, but in that time I feel that I was not understood at the first, and the art I made was not understood by others. So I do care about the audience give me the comments and feedback, good or bad. I mean, who wouldn't care?
Yeah, exactly.
If you really want to get better and care about your career very much, I think everyone gonna read one by one, right? So yeah.
Did it help you? Did it make you change? So like some things, and is it better now? Like,
yeah. However, I realized in the future collections, I would divide into 2 parts. One for showcase, another for commercial. So I always think ways to how to combine them together well. Yeah, it's
smart. So you actually took the criticism.
Yeah.
Having a mom who was always super critical of my work, I feel like that might have been from your mom. Because my mom used to say things like, "That looks like it was more fun to do than to more fun to do than to watch." I was like,
fun to do to watch.
Ouch.
But was it fun though?
What?
Was it actually fun?
When I used to dance, she'd be like, "That looked really like it must have been really fun to do. It wasn't that fun to watch, but yeah, they can be in some ways the most cruel. Your parents and your parents, because they just don't hold anything back. But it sounds like you made it into something positive for yourself.
Yeah, I think when students in the school, we just environment make us we're always thinking how to make work, nothing else.
So we were living it, breathing it.
So
only cared about that. It's interesting. I mean, when you are a writer, you're also a model. I mean, I don't know if you've ever done criticism per se, but you've been sort of almost like
criticized.
All
the time. It's my job. Well, sort of like, you know, going to castings. This is what people are there for.
How does that work?
Well, so
I would not be able to have a strong heart in those instances. I really like it. Wow.
Well, I'm sort of like, going to a casting in the beginning, it didn't register, but actually it's preparing for a job interview. It is a job interview essentially, and you only, you spend like an hour getting ready, you spend an hour to go somewhere, you spend another 30 minutes waiting, and then you have 2 minutes, and that's it. And then you're like, I don't have a clue if I got the job or they don't like me. So, but again, sort of like going to my agent every time we have a meeting, I'm like, okay, tell me what I need in order to get better. Criticize me, because sometimes this is what you need. And again, you have to choose your critics, you have to choose your enemies, because this is the only way that you can get better. Another problem of like social media sometimes is like, of getting like a hype or anything. Like everyone says, oh my God, you're amazing. And you're like, you you are amazing. But sometimes you're like, but how I'm going to get better? Or is this comes from your heart, or is this because you want to be close to, get the cloud or get the hype or get like the event for like, get an invitation for an event? So again.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I think I definitely think that's true. I remember having the strictest, meanest ballet teacher. Like we were all terrified of her. But if she did give you a comment that was positive, you were like, what? It was the power of someone withholding, or and then someone giving. So I think you're right. I think this, on one hand, like the lack of criticism means, or the lack of critical criticism informed critical criticism, okay, that's, I'm going to keep adding to that, means that you get a lot of kind of like empty platitudes, right?
Exactly.
And then it's not easy to sort of know how to deal with that either.
And so my way of sort of like navigating this is I won't believe all the compliments if I'm not believing all sort of like the negative bullying, sort of like, you know, nasty comments. So sort of like you have to find your balance in this.
But I don't think that the comments need to be nasty though. That's the point. I think when they're nasty, then it comes from a place of malice.
I agree.
And I think, you know, it's really important, again, like balance is the key word. Like we, with our like summer school, and we have 14, 17-year-olds, or with our mentees or workshops, at the end of a session that we do, I'll always give constructive feedback about somebody's works. We did a photography workshop, and actually we looked at everybody's pictures in front of, you know, each other to kind of take in what it is that they've created. And, you know, we might say, this one's amazing because of this, and actually perhaps you could have thought about shooting this in a different way. And it's, again, so that they have something to contrast against when they're shooting or creating something the next time. So it's never to tear you down. It's actually, and I think it's really important, and I know you were saying for as a student, sometimes you don't want the criticism or the feedback because actually you're finding your feet. But I think sometimes it helps you to get onto more solid ground.
No, I think, so I think we always want, I think it was the opposite, like we always want to hear it, and we're also so used to it, it's kind of like just an everyday thing for us. It's just at the end of it, like how much do we actually take from it? Like I think if we don't get sometimes if we don't really get any feedback on our work, it's like, oh, what did I do wrong? You know, that's what we usually always, you know, not used to, but basically it's just an everyday thing. And I think often when they're critiquing our work, that's when we know they're actually, you know, caring about what we're doing, and they really want to help us improve or take certain parts of that and then develop that in the next work. And I think especially in first year, a lot of our projects are built like that as well, that it's so quick and so fast paced. It's always one technique or a way of how I work, and then I take that on to the next project, which is a completely different thing, and kind of just building the whole picture together. But that often is quite difficult, I think, to put the puzzles together. And I think it depends on how old you are, how much experience you have. You know, there's a few of us who are very young, a few of us who are a bit older in the course, which then means that we've got previous experiences and we're able to put the picture together ourselves, because that's up to you. You know.
But I think one of the things that I guess you're also speaking to, which also jumped out to me, is everyone has a different relationship with criticism. You're both at CSM, right?
Yeah.
I think CSM is a great place because it forces you to become comfortable with criticism, but actually most other schools don't do that. So I think you're in a good place to sort of develop a good relationship with criticism, because it does actually make you stronger in your point of view, because you've considered what everybody else in the room had to say and then came to your conclusion.
My question is, for designers and also models, of course, it's how do you take that criticism if you're not used to getting it? How do you do it?
Well, for
if
me,
you want to survive.
Or
if you disagree with it.
Well, I think that's the thing. For me, what I always encourage my students or whoever to do is to stop listening to what's being said and try to figure out what they actually mean when they say what they say. Because you can say the same thing in 100 different ways, but you as the person who's taking on this criticism, you read it in very different ways. So I think the important thing is to not listen to the actual words that are coming out of that person's mouth, but what do they actually mean when they say that X, Y, and Z? And I think that is where the value of figuring out how to have a good relationship with criticism actually comes in, because the critique isn't the critique is an opening of another sort of realm of considerations. And I think that's kind of how you have to sort of view criticism. It's not necessarily
subtext or kind of you're kind of blowing my mind right now a little bit with that. And I love that. It's that. You're right, because even in friendships and relationships, it's as much about the subtext, the kind of unsaid meaning. I mean, I could say to you, that was amazing, but I didn't like this. Or I could say, you could say the same words, and they would have have completely different meanings.
Exactly. And you can say the same words, and I say the same words, but they mean completely different things as well.
That's so true. And also, I think what is interesting, actually, me and Sophie were speaking about it on our way here, is that what you were referring back to, what you're saying, like what directions criticism is coming from. Like, for example, we work together a lot. Like, how does that balance work when you're working with someone or like collaborating? Like, how does that balance kind of work out, and like how much does the other person say, and then you take that onwards, or like do you have an argument about it?
But I guess I say with that, you build trust with that person to honestly give you feedback on what something is and how they perceive it, and you respect and value it in that sense. So I always kind of say, find your tribe. You know, I saw you came in wearing a Campbell Addy. He's probably part of your tribe. And you probably go to him to perhaps look at maybe campaign images or shots if he's not taken them, to kind of give an honest feedback perhaps. And it's like, you have those 5 or 6 or up to 10 people, whatever, and I think you keep it tight of those people that you look at as being your confidants, that you invite into the room. And I think it's that you invite them into the room to give you their opinion and feedback, because you know it's not coming from a place where they're looking to tear you down.
But also you trust them.
You trust them. And they're there to build you up, not to just say the words that you want to hear. They're there to build you up in the way of sometimes saying, do you know what, that's not as great as it could be. Look at it from this different perspective. And I think I have those people with the work that I do, and it makes my work better.
I think it's really important to know, because I also have a mother that always says, I'm your biggest critic. And I'm always trying to figure out how to get her to, because she's right, and a lot of what she says is usually right, but the way that you deliver it isn't very helpful. So you could be my biggest critic and actually the greatest help to my work, but actually it just comes across as being very mean. So it's also about finding the right language of how do you actually give this critique in a way that's actually helpful to the person. I see that a lot as a tutor, that everyone is a case-by-case basis. The way that I speak about a work with one student is very different to how I speak with another student, because you have to understand the language that the person can receive that communication in.
That's a very good point. Meeting them where they are. But I mean, I think it's interesting. Almost depends on what you're being critiqued on. Like I still think, like if your body is being critiqued, that's a whole different thing. I don't know, like your body, your face. These are things that are not. You can't. It's not like you can.
But are these critiques or just opinions?
They are.
When it goes to that point, it's like, okay, a critique is something that allows you to then take that on and then become better, but
an opinion.
Pointing out something about the way that something actually is and will not change, I don't necessarily know if that still constitutes as critique.
Yeah, you're probably right. I mean,
I don't know, for me, sort of like, well, yeah, obviously I value the opinion of others and people that I trust, but also I feel that it comes with what are my goals? Like, do I want to please my mom? Do I want to please my agent? Do I want to please myself? So it's like, I feel also it's like a matter of goals, because, everyone can say whatever they want, but, at the end of the day, it's you and your work, and it's what you want to put out there. Like, you're taking sort of like the risk of putting yourself out there. Obviously, some people are going to like you. Obviously, some people are not going to like you. But again, it's what do you want to achieve? Because what sort of like would make my mom happy is different to what would make myself or my agent or a brand or a magazine happy. So again, I think it's like doing this internal work of actually finding the like super sort of like clear goals of what I want to achieve. And then, obviously you figure out along the way, but I don't think you need to, even if someone that you trust, you can't let them change your direction.
You talked about wanting to choose your enemies. I would love you to talk a bit more about that. It's something that I... if we think about enemies in a more constructive way, like what does that look like? I mean, enemies obviously in fashion. I think fashion is super tribal on its own. Like without any, without even sort of handpicking your tribe or your people, it sort of just has this very, I think it's maybe by virtue of like how the fashion industry, where it operates and how it reflects culture in a very specific way, but it is very tribal, isn't it? It's like you're either this tribe or that tribe, or you don't fit. God forbid you try to do more than one thing like you, and sort of try to do both, you're both a writer and a model, it's like people are like, whoa, hold on a second.
I don't know what to do.
But how do you sort of, I'd love to hear more about that.
I don't know, for me it's about ethics, so in the sense of like it's not necessarily aesthetic, because I'm happy to create sort of like different things, and also my job as a model is to be a canvas. I don't make any executive decisions, but in the same time it's ethics. Like I don't want to work with someone who's rude, and I think it's like, again, for like they said, it just works for everyone and comes from like models as well. Like people don't want to work with someone who might be like a tiny bit sort of like, like more thin or sort of like an inch taller if you're rude. So it's just simple as that, because you can spend 8 hours, probably more, of your day with one person. You don't want someone to be rude and mean and bringing like bad energy, and at the end of the day you can't work. So
it's not worth it.
Yeah.
So choose your enemies means like avoid. So what's a good version of an enemy?
Someone who's rude, someone for me who's, again, it's like completely
so
up to
for
me.
you, okay, I
So it's
think
like, someone who's like super conservative, someone who sort of like doesn't want to progress, someone who's just mean for the sake of being mean, just, as a power play. And, we've all been in work environments when we've seen those people.
Yes.
They're quite toxic.
But do you seek, because I'm still getting my head around it.
Yes.
Do you seek out these people, or is it that you avoid these people?
No, but if it's like, if I have to work with them, like, I'm happy if they don't like me, because that means that I'm not that person. So brilliant. I don't want to be associated with, it's branding at the end of the day, if you say it from like, a fashion perspective. Like, you don't want to be associated with someone who's not a good person to work with, no?
Yeah, no, that's fair.
So yeah, and in the same time, that sort of like brings more people. You might say, oh yeah, Nasser is actually sort of like, it's actually quite nice. I want to work with her. I don't want to be, so it's branding. Like, you're going to attract some people. You're going to sort of like push away some people. So again, it's a matter of you making sort of like that work and internal work and be like, yeah, I want to be that person. I want to have those ethics.
I think it's about kind of understanding your value systems and
Exactly.
what also doesn't fit into your value system.
Yeah. Exactly. Because again, as creatives, it's so easy to be swept away by trends and sort of like different waves and different aesthetics. So yeah, I think it's good to have a value system with
I think I understand. So it's almost like choosing your enemies is like letting go of the approval of those people because you just don't care, because they don't have an impact. They don't align with the way you see the world, and that it's okay that you don't see eye to eye. Do I understand?
Yeah. This is the Korean philosophy actually. This is what it says, that you want to have enemies, you want to have people that doesn't align with your vision, because that means that you're doing something right.
That you're clear-headed in your approach. Okay, interesting. I love this. But when you're a student, or when you're starting out, do you feel the pressure of almost getting along with everyone and being willing to almost muck in and do whatever? It's like it's harder, I think, to have a clear sense of your boundaries when you're.
Yeah, I was actually thinking of something similar. Is that I think with like our classmates, not really, but sometimes I was actually just thinking like, do you subconsciously want to make work that your tutors will like? Like that's a different balance. And sometimes you might not even realize that you're making work that this aesthetic they're going to really like, or it's so crazy or like so different that they're definitely going to like that. So I was just thinking of like when
you just want to please your tutors.
I don't think I would say I want to please my tutors. It's just like subconsciously, like even like with the every task you're getting or like stuff you have to do is, are you making work that they're gonna like, But I think I'm not like, you don't want to do that deliberately. And I think
that's totally normal. I think there's a thing, like if I went to art school in the US, and they say that there's like for the first year, you're basically recreating the stuff that is in line with your kind of core instructor's aesthetic. And then about a year after that, you sort of shuff that off and you kind of get left with something that's so I think it's very normal for that to happen, by the way. But yes, I think you're right. So like that pull between wanting to do something that people will like, or at least the person who's deciding your degree and your grade will like, and doing something that aligns with you. And
but at the same time, I think like what they're trying to teach us at university is like always trying to make stuff that is different, and like people that they won't like, even they might look at it at first like hold on, like what is this, and then like think of it like actually this is very interesting, it's very new, like I never thought of it before. So I think they're also kind of trying to to make you do that. And I think what's also funny is that you know, we're talking about like, you know, being honest, like giving honest feedback, but am I subconsciously like, oh, like if my tutor's watching right now, like, you know, like...
We know he is as well.
Yeah, we know he is. Like, am I saying stuff that I want to please him, you know, at the same time?
We all have a different version of that, which is like, I wonder if that brand that I'm consulting for is listening to this right now. Or I wonder if that magazine that I used to work with, I mean, that never goes completely, I don't think, frankly.
It's that palatability. You know, we all want to be palatable in many ways. So it's kind of like you might sometimes dull something slightly.
Well, some of it, and I do think, I don't know if this is just me, I'd love to hear your view, because I think my feeling is if I'm going to critique a student's work or work in general, I'd really like to meet them where they are and give them something that I feel like is just going to be enough to take them. You know, I don't know that I would necessarily like dump a huge amount of critique on someone that either I didn't think could handle it. I mean, you obviously did great things with that, so well done to you.
Thank you.
But I think largely, like, that's really tough. It's tough on, you know, someone who's starting out to have someone just kind of go, bleh. You know, how do you sort through that? So I like to give just what I think is going to be the most useful. So I think you're right. I think there's an element of like judging who you're speaking to and how much they really want and what they can work with. And I think someone who does that very well is Sarah Mower. I think she's a critic, but she's also a mentor. So I think like for many of the designers, because she's been in the industry a long time, she has, you know, if not mentored them herself directly at some point in their career, she's been in that space where she's willing to give them, I think, that sort of nurturing guidance. She sort of puts her money where her mouth is effectively. And I really respect that. And I think people respect her critique more because she's not vindictive, she's careful, she's considered, and because she puts the time into the mentorship side as well. So she sort of gives back on that level as well.
It's the nurturing element, 100%. And as you touched on with your students, you understand where to meet that person at with the way that you speak to them. And I think actually the people who are nurturing are the people who are best at being critics, because I think they, again, look at it with a layer of, well, I'm not here to tear you down, I'm here to build you up. So actually, what can I say that will make it better and make you look at things with a different eye? Because again, like if you look at that same piece of work with the same eye all the time, you're not looking at it critically, you're looking at it in terms of just looking at it. You know, it's like when a designer brings in a stylist to come in and style their work, because if you just do all of that, it's potentially going to be on one note. And so having that other element of objectivity, I think, is and nurturing is crucial.
I'm also aware that, you know, the C-suite or the, you know, the financial decisions around a brand are often made based on the response. And I'm not saying just the fashion criticism. I don't think it's just about that. It's bigger than that, obviously. But, you know, I'm thinking of, I mean, should I name it? I mean, I feel kind of always like, should I name the name? Let's talk about Anne de Meulemeester, the kind of very, very brief sort of stay there. I don't know what went into that decision, but I think it's interesting that on one level, I didn't love that first collection. It didn't resonate to me because I love the brand as I've always known it. So whether or not, I mean, my criticism is completely objective is a whole other thing. But I think it's interesting that he wasn't given more time to develop. I would have liked him to have more time. I think it's a little unfair. But I don't know what the decision was around that. It could have had to do more with what he does in his personal life. I don't know. But I think it's interesting because that adds another layer. We were talking about that at the beginning of the conversation when you're a designer. One of the people here had been a designer, creative director at Guy Laroche. And, you know, for him, that criticism was like make or break. So that has a different weight too, right? It's sort of who's making that decision and then how does it impact the brand on that bigger level. That's also really interesting.
Yeah, and it makes me worried for Maximilian, not because anything that he's doing is wrong, but he's 27? He's only been running his brand for a few years prior. Now he's at, you know, Ferragamo. are they going to be there to support him? Because, you know, he's now got to run the design studio and team, set this creative direction and
That's
vision.
a big learning curve.
And also a lot of responsibility on one person. And we've seen it happen with the chap from Bali, who's gone after a year and a bit.
Yeah.
You've barely got time to hang your, you know, to put your coat on the hook before you're being told to put your coat back on.
Yeah, I think they should be given a bit more time. I think even if the reception isn't great, I think they should get more time to get the opportunity to actually take the criticism or take the feedback and change it or not.
Yeah, or not. But,
not.
you know, Daniel at Burberry had Christopher kind of support him as he kind of got off with taking the reins of the brand. And hopefully with that tutorage or that mentorship and that nurturing, that's going to allow Daniel to grow within his role at Burberry so that actually he becomes a success there.
Yeah.
Because if not, if you don't have somebody backing you, supporting you, who understands it, then actually you're kind of being set up to fail, I feel.
I'd like to hear from you. How do you feel about criticism now? Because obviously that was when you were graduating. Do you feel the same? Do you feel kind of like, ooh, or do you sometimes bring it?
Yeah, sometimes I really feel annoying, but it depends which day I feel I have a good or bad mood.
That's true.
Yeah, but now I think I like my heart kind of like how to say mechanical, like a stone something. I just get used to it. Yeah, I love to hear more compliment, of course. But I think, and also I think which is a criticism really can help me to improve. Yeah, especially the professionals. So yeah, I really care about.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
So you seem to have come up with a good understanding.
I still ignore my parents say.
I think that's wise. I think that's wise because also I think your parents have a hidden agenda to Nancy's point. Like, is their agenda really for you to make your best work, or is it for you to stop doing fashion and go become a dentist?
My dad always asked me, when can you make a clothes for me? My dad always. I think my parents kind of gave up as well. They just let me go, let me free.
I think it's also important to keep, I know it sounds very like a work-life sort of like balance in the sense of like, you know, it's 7 o'clock, turning off the laptop, you know, it's done, you know, because at the end of the day, it's like work and, you know, it is creative. You put yourself out there and you put like parts of yourself and your character and your experience and it's very emotional, but at the end of the day, it's work. And okay, someone might not like sort of like the dresses that I make, but you know, I'm still a nice person. So sort of like I think it's also good to have this balance or have sort of like some sort of exactly, and some other things to keep you a bit grounded. That it's fine, even if it's amazing, it's fine. Like you know, it doesn't mean that I'm a goddess. You know,
sometimes too much compliments gonna make me feel lots of pressure because I should holding it. Yeah, keep doing good.
In psychology, it says that it has the same emotional substance. You know, saying something very positive to you has the same sort of like effect on the body as saying something very negative to you. It's still intense. It's still saying to you that you're the most amazing thing I've ever seen in my life. And you're like, okay. Also, like saying something completely negative as well. So sometimes it's good to be grounded, and you just, you know, it's always in the middle, somewhere in the middle.
I also think that you have to be able to critique yourself. If you can't critique yourself, then the weight of criticism on you would be so much greater. If you can actually look at your work objectively and form your own opinion, separate to what it felt like when you were doing it, then you can welcome any critique because you actually know that color that you used may not have been the best one, but that's what was available. So any critique that comes about that, it's very easy to just water off a duck's back.
I wanted to actually ask you, like, how do you do self-critique?
By looking at my work and being objective about it.
So, like, do you do it? Does actually some like a critic can change your mind?
I don't think.
You sort of know, don't you, when you look at it, whether you feel like it's
I don't like to be. I do not like to be lied to, and I don't lie to my friends. I feel like you have to really be honest with yourself, and I'm very honest with myself. even the times when I just left uni and the work that I was making might not have sort of tipped into that level of, okay, you can actually wear this on a daily basis. I knew what I was doing at that time, and my intention was to make clothes that you cannot necessarily wear on a daily basis.
Exactly, yeah.
So you have to be honest with yourself in what your intentions actually are, and so that when the critiques come in of this is not clothes that you can wear on a daily basis, you know that you are not intending to make clothes that you can wear on a daily basis.
You get
so that's fine, but not everyone can understand where you actually are in your journey and your progress and what your intentions are for that collection or for that season or for that year that you're projecting. Maybe for that year you want to sell only the t-shirts in the collection, so everything else needs to be super crazy and like nobody's going to want it because you want them to focus on that. But only you really know what
you want.
The intentions of your work actually is. So I think you have to, for me, the way that I do it is just I look at objectively of what I'm doing, what my intentions are. I set aims, I set goals. I also move very malleably. I think it's very important as young designers to not be stuck in what you think is right, but actually being able to move freely. Because that's just the life that we live in right now, and that's just the world that we live in right now, and being so hell-bent on what something should be and trying to make something so perfect, I think, is not where we should be. And I think my work in general tries to present a vision of a future that actually does not look perfect. And I do think that actually what I've presented is communicating in that way. But this idea of perfection, I think, is we need to shed that. This idea that having the perfect color, the perfect shade, this history that fashion coming from the top down has given us of like things needing to be the ultimate perfection. I think we don't actually live in that society anymore, and it's not possible to live in that society.
I don't know that we ever did.
And we never did, exactly.
But that was definitely a real thing, right? That's what everybody was aiming for. You're so right. I mean, actually, I've never tried to put this into words, but you're really reminding me of something that I've developed in both my writing and just my life in general. It's like, I'm definitely a perfectionist. I've always been, probably. I see it in my children. I'm like, oh, here we go. But I've learned as I've gotten older, both in terms of my expectation of myself and my expectation of my work, and it's not going to sound, I don't think it's going to sound right, but here we go.
Go for it.
It's like almost like a cultivated ambivalence, and it sounds very different than what you're describing. I like a lot more what you're describing, which is self-awareness and understanding. What I mean by that is there are times when I write a piece that I really like, and there are times where I think, frankly, it wasn't very good. And I think not that long ago, I would have found it really, really hard to accept that it wasn't what I wanted. So I would make stories to myself, like, well, it was fine. I could actually, no, it just wasn't what I was, it didn't get where I wanted it to go. That's okay. That ambivalence piece is more that kind of like, I just don't want to spend that much time and energy thinking about it.
Right.
So I'm going to move on to the next thing.
Exactly.
Whereas before, I think when I started out, I'm looking at you two, when I started out, I just felt like if it wasn't exactly right, if it wasn't perfect, I felt any criticism would have just hit me over the edge because I was already so judging myself so hard, but not in a constructive way. So it was sort of now, I think, being a little bit ambivalent, being like, okay, if I mess it, if it's not perfect,
it's fine.
But,
it's okay.
But what is perfection?
Right, I mean, exactly.
You get
right?
to define what perfect is to you.
Yeah.
Because for me, like, with each collection that I've done, I look back at it and I'm like, didn't love that, but it doesn't matter because the next one I'm going to make it better, and the next one I'm going to make it better. And I think that's what you have to hold on to.
As long as you keep moving.
As long as you keep moving. And I think, like, even with the last show that I did, the most imperfect thing within the collection to me is the most perfect. So you'd really get to define what your aims, your intentions, your goals, your parameters, and also you can give the words the meaning that you think actually is right, because you actually have that power as creative individuals.
That's very true.
This is what you see with prolific artists as well. You see you see Picasso and you think, sort of genius, but you see some of his work and it's not that good. But I think obviously he went through the stage like, it's fine, I'll just keep on doing. You won't say, oh, I'm not going to do, I'm just going to focus on one thing that wasn't good. It's fine, you just keep going. And sort of like maybe even if like 60% of your work is good, you still have this 60%. Great.
So you never get there.
But don't you think fame and celebrity make us revise our idea of criticism very quickly. Like someone who's, I don't know, in both directions. On one hand, if someone is famous or has a degree of fame or notoriety, on one hand, we're either more critical sometimes, or we give them carte blanche. Like we're like, oh, everything they do is just fantastic, until it isn't. But I mean, I've always felt for myself, not that anyone's asked, but I would not want to be that level. I would not want to have that level of scrutiny or fame or whatever, however you want to call it, because it's just feels like terrifying, terrifying to have so many people expecting something of you either way. But I think it's interesting as we're talking about process, and we're talking, I imagine, you know, artists, designers, people who have that level of fame, they still have a lot of the same problems, complications. They're still dealing with they're still human beings, but they just have this huge weight of everybody having an opinion either direction. Just, you know, again, terrifying. I don't know how they do it. I give them some props for.
Yeah, I don't know how they do it. I think when you get on that level, your reality becomes different. So you almost like you evolve into something else because human beings, we actually are very adaptable. Sometimes we forget how quickly actually we can adapt to the circumstances that we're given. I mean, a couple of years ago, we were all inside and just making it work, and now we could not imagine actually that being a reality again. And if it does happen, we probably would just like roll up our sleeves and just get on with it. So it's very easy that once you get into this, like where that is your reality, you find ways to move through it. And I think that's the key, finding ways to always move through wherever you are to get to whatever it is that you're trying to go.
I actually think that might be the perfect ending to this day. I mean, Abby just told me it was basically 4 o'clock, which honestly, the time has gone by so fast. I have no idea what time it actually is.
It's 4 o'clock.
I think we should end it, but I just wanted to say thank you so much for all of your, I mean, we can happily continue this discussion offline, but you know, if you're listening out there, thanks for joining us. And yeah, I really appreciate all of your input and your perspective. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Nice to meet you guys.
It's a lovely meeting you all.
I think we might still be rolling, but we can just keep going.
No, I love the fact that, you know, usually you meet people and you start with like a really sort of like simple